before there were camps, before there were gas chambers, before the world learned names like Auschwitz or Treblinka, there were men with rifles. They did not wear striped uniforms. They did not stand behind barbed wire. They walked into towns in broad daylight. They knocked on doors. They led families to the edge of forests, ravines, and open fields, and they shot them. These men were called the Einsatzgruppen, Hitler's mobile killing units. They followed the German army across Eastern Europe, not to fight soldiers, but to erase civilians. Entire Jewish communities, Roma families, political opponents, anyone the Nazi state decided should no longer exist. There were no factories of death yet, no chimneys, no numbers tattooed on arms, just pits in the earth, and silence afterward. By the time the extermination camps were built, nearly 2 million people were already dead, murdered face to face by ordinary men who returned to their meals afterward. Tonight, we tell the full story of the Einsatzgruppen, where they came from, how ideology became obedience, how paperwork turned into mass murder, and how history tried, and often failed, to bring them to justice. This is not a story told loudly. It does not rush. It does not shock for effect. It remembers. Before we begin, take a moment to comment where you're listening from tonight. And if you value calm, historically grounded documentaries like this, consider subscribing so these stories are never forgotten. Now, let us begin at the moment when genocide left the shadows and stepped into the open. Chapter 1. Segment 1. The Ideological Groundwork. Long before the first Einsatzgruppen units assembled and moved east with rifles and orders, the conditions that made their crimes possible were already firmly in place, shaped by years of ideological conditioning, political radicalization, and the systematic erosion of moral boundaries within German society, beginning in the aftermath of the First World War, when defeat, humiliation, and economic collapse created fertile ground for extremist narratives that promised renewal through exclusion, purity, and blame. In this environment, Adolf Hitler and the National Socialist movement did not invent anti-Semitism, but they weaponized it, transforming centuries-old prejudices into a modern, bureaucratic doctrine of racial hierarchy that framed Jews not merely as outsiders, but as an existential threat to the German nation itself, a force supposedly responsible for military defeat, economic suffering, cultural decay, and political instability. Through relentless propaganda, education, and law, this worldview was normalized, repeated until it felt self-evident, embedding the idea that certain lives held no value and that their removal was not only justified, but necessary for national survival. As the Nazi regime consolidated power after 1933, ideology was reinforced through institutions, with universities, police forces, civil services, and especially the SS becoming laboratories for radical loyalty, where ambition and obedience were rewarded and moral hesitation was treated as weakness or betrayal. The SS, under Heinrich Himmler, evolved into more than a security force. It became an ideological order, presenting itself as the racial elite of the German people, trained to see themselves as guardians of a future purified world, unburdened by what Nazi doctrine described as racial enemies. Within this framework, violence was reframed as duty and compassion was redefined as treason. The legal system itself was reshaped to align with this worldview, stripping Jews of citizenship, property, and protection through measures like the Nuremberg laws, which reduce human beings to categories and statistics, making later acts of violence appear as administrative steps rather than moral ruptures. By the late 1930s, public acts of persecution such as Kristallnacht demonstrated that mass violence against Jews could occur openly with little consequence, signaling to perpetrators that the state would not only tolerate brutality, but celebrate it when framed as ideological necessity. At the same time, the Nazi leadership increasingly spoke in coded language about solutions, removals, and cleansing, terms that concealed intent while preparing the population psychologically for escalating actions. When Germany invaded Poland in 1939, this ideological machinery moved with the army, bringing with it special task forces designed to eliminate political resistance, intellectual leadership, and Jewish communities behind the front lines, marking a critical shift from persecution to systematic killing. These early units were the direct ancestors of the Einsatzgruppen, operating with the assumption that mass murder was not an aberration of war, but a strategic tool of racial policy. The men recruited into these formations were not drawn from the margins of society. Many were educated professionals, lawyers, teachers, and administrators who had internalized the regime's values and believed their actions were historically justified. Training emphasized discipline, efficiency, and emotional detachment, reinforcing the idea that killing was a technical task carried out in service of a higher cause, rather than a moral choice. By the time Operation Barbarossa was planned in 1941, the invasion of the Soviet Union that would unleash the Einsatzgruppen on an unprecedented scale, the ideological foundations were complete. Jews were defined as enemies beyond humanity. Bolshevism was portrayed as a Jewish conspiracy, and war itself was framed as a racial struggle requiring total annihilation of the opponent. The genocide that followed did not erupt spontaneously. It flowed logically from years of indoctrination that taught men to see murder as policy, obedience as virtue, and silence as loyalty, creating a world in which extraordinary crimes could be committed by ordinary individuals who believed or convinced themselves that they were simply doing their duty within the machinery of history. Chapter 1, Segment 2, From Ideology to Organization. As Nazi ideology hardened into policy, the transition from abstract hatred to structured violence required organization, authority, and men willing to translate belief into action. And it was within this space that the machinery of mass killing began to take shape, long before the world understood what was unfolding. Following the invasion of Poland in September 1939, the German leadership confronted a problem they had already anticipated: how to control, pacify, and reshape vast territories filled with populations defined by Nazi doctrine as racially inferior, politically dangerous, or biologically disposable. The answer was not left to improvisation. Special units were formed under the authority of the SS and the Reich Security Main Office, tasked with operating behind advancing German forces to secure conquered areas through terror, elimination, and intimidation. These early formations, initially focused on political opponents, Polish intelligentsia, and community leaders, established a model that would later be perfected and expanded into the Einsatzgruppen. Reinhard Heydrich, one of the most powerful and ruthless figures in the Nazi hierarchy, played a central role in shaping this approach, insisting that security could only be achieved through preemptive destruction of perceived enemies, a philosophy that fused policing, intelligence, and execution into a single function. Under his guidance, the concept of special treatment, a euphemism for murder, entered official language, allowing mass killing to be discussed in reports and orders without explicit acknowledgement, further distancing perpetrators from the reality of their actions. The men selected for these tasks were deliberately chosen for reliability rather than brutality alone. They were expected to follow orders precisely, maintain discipline, and carry out executions efficiently, often documenting their progress through detailed reports sent back to Berlin. This bureaucratic framework transformed murder into a measurable output, counted in numbers, categorized by group, and evaluated for effectiveness. As Germany expanded its ambitions eastward, these units were refined, reorganized, and formally designated as Einsatzgruppen, divided into smaller Einsatzkommandos and Sonderkommandos that could move rapidly, adapt to local conditions, and coordinate with army units, local collaborators, and police forces. Their mandate extended beyond immediate security concerns to encompass ideological cleansing, with explicit instructions to eliminate Jews, Roma, communist officials, and anyone deemed a threat to German racial and political objectives. What distinguished these units from earlier forms of repression was not only the scale of their violence, but its systematic nature. Executions were planned, sites selected, logistics arranged, and victims gathered through deception or force, often with the assistance of local authorities coerced or convinced to participate. The killers themselves operated within a hierarchy that emphasized obedience and initiative simultaneously, rewarding those who demonstrated zeal while punishing hesitation, creating an environment in which cruelty became a career asset. Training emphasized not only weapons handling and operational procedures, but ideological reinforcement, ensuring that participants viewed their victims not as individuals, but as abstract enemies whose removal was framed as a service to the Reich. Alcohol, peer pressure, and ritualized routines were often used to dull emotional responses, while commanders maintained distance from the actual killings to preserve a sense of administrative control. Reports from the field reveal how quickly this structure normalized mass execution, with early shock giving way to routine as units refined their methods and increased their efficiency. Villages were cleared, ghettos liquidated, and entire communities erased with chilling regularity, often in broad daylight, surrounded by soldiers, collaborators, and civilians who were forced to watch or assist. By the time plans for the invasion of the Soviet Union were finalized, the Einsatzgruppen were no longer experimental units operating on the margins of military campaigns. They were a central component of Nazi strategy, fully integrated into the war effort and entrusted with carrying out one of the regime's most radical objectives. Their existence reflected a crucial shift in the nature of Nazi violence, moving from persecution and terror to open, systematic genocide, carried out not in hidden chambers, but in fields, forests, and ravines, where ideology, organization, and obedience converged to produce a killing apparatus unlike anything the modern world had seen before. Chapter 1, Segment 3, The Men Who Would Carry It Out. What made the Einsatzgruppen uniquely terrifying was not only the authority they were given, but the ordinary nature of the men who filled their ranks. Individuals who only months earlier had lived unremarkable civilian lives as clerks, teachers, lawyers, students, and professionals, now absorbed into a system that demanded participation in mass murder as routine duty. Recruitment for these units did not rely solely on hardened criminals or ideological extremists. Instead, it drew heavily from educated middle-class backgrounds, men who were seen as dependable, disciplined, and capable of following complex instructions without question. Many held university degrees, especially in law and administration, and this background was considered an asset, as the work of the Einsatzgruppen required record-keeping, coordination with military authorities, and the ability to manage large-scale operations efficiently. Their transformation was not sudden, but gradual, shaped by years of propaganda, social pressure, and institutional reinforcement that reframed violence as necessity and cruelty as responsibility. Training emphasized obedience, loyalty to the Führer, and the belief that personal morality must be subordinated entirely to the needs of the state, creating a psychological environment in which refusal was framed as weakness or betrayal. Once deployed, these men operated within tightly structured command chains that minimized individual accountability, allowing each participant to view his role as only one small component of a larger process, thereby diffusing responsibility for the outcome. Language played a critical role in this transformation. Orders avoided explicit references to killing, instead using bureaucratic terms that reduced human lives to categories and tasks, making the act itself feel procedural rather than personal. Over time, repeated exposure to violence, combined with encouragement from superiors and validation through promotions and commendations, eroded moral resistance, replacing it with a sense of professional pride in efficiency and effectiveness. Social dynamics within the units further reinforced conformity, as shared experiences created bonds that discouraged dissent and normalized participation, while those who expressed discomfort were often reassigned, marginalized, or pressured until they complied. Alcohol was frequently provided before or after operations, serving both as a coping mechanism and a tool of control, dulling emotional responses and fostering group cohesion. Crucially, participation was rarely enforced at gunpoint. Most members later admitted they could have avoided direct involvement without severe punishment, a fact that underscores the extent to which internalized ideology and social expectation drove their actions. This willingness to comply revealed how thoroughly Nazi doctrine had penetrated institutional culture, reshaping perceptions of duty, honor, and morality. As operations expanded, the men of the Einsatzgruppen became increasingly desensitized, with early reports expressing discomfort giving way to detached statistical summaries of completed actions, reflecting a psychological shift from shock to normalization. Their work unfolded not in secret isolation, but in occupied territories where soldiers, collaborators, and civilians were often aware of what was happening, further reinforcing the sense that these acts were sanctioned, expected, and justified. By embedding genocide within the framework of military operations and administrative procedure, the Nazi leadership ensured that responsibility was dispersed across layers of command, allowing individuals to rationalize their participation as unavoidable or insignificant. Yet the cumulative effect of these individual choices produced one of the most extensive campaigns of mass murder in history, carried out not by mythical monsters, but by men who learned to silence conscience in favor of obedience. Understanding who these men were and how they came to accept their roles is essential to understanding how genocide becomes possible, not through sudden madness, but through gradual moral collapse, institutional encouragement, and the steady erosion of empathy under the weight of ideology and authority. Chapter 2, Segment 1, The Invasion That Unleashed the Killing. On June 22, 1941, as German forces crossed the border into the Soviet Union under Operation Barbarossa, the Einsatzgruppen moved with them, not as an afterthought, but as an integral component of the invasion itself, tasked with a mission that extended far beyond military conquest and into the deliberate destruction of entire populations. This was war redefined, not only as a clash of armies, but as a campaign of ideological annihilation, where civilians were recast as enemies to be eliminated in the name of racial and political purification. The invasion unfolded across vast territories, stretching from the Baltic states through Belarus and Ukraine and deep into Soviet lands. And everywhere the German army advanced, the Einsatzgruppen followed, operating in the shadows of frontline units, establishing control in newly occupied areas before any semblance of civilian administration could emerge. Their orders were explicit in intent, if often vague in language, directing them to neutralize perceived threats such as communist officials, intellectuals, partisans, and, most centrally, Jewish populations, who were collectively blamed for Bolshevism and portrayed as an existential danger to the Reich. This framing allowed mass murder to be presented as a preventative measure, a grim necessity to secure German rear areas and ensure the success of the campaign. Upon entering towns and villages, Einsatzgruppen commanders coordinated closely with Wehrmacht officers, local police, and collaborators, gathering intelligence on residents, identifying targets, and organizing roundups that frequently began within days of occupation. Jewish men were often seized first under the pretense of registration or labor requirements, followed soon by women, children, and the elderly as policies radicalized with breathtaking speed. Victims were marched to nearby forests, ravines, or open fields, places chosen for their isolation and suitability for concealment, where mass shootings were conducted in a methodical manner that emphasized efficiency over spectacle. These operations were documented in meticulous reports sent back to Berlin, listing numbers killed by category and location, transforming human lives into statistics that testified to progress rather than atrocity. As weeks turned into months, the scale of the killings expanded dramatically, with entire communities erased in single operations, leaving behind emptied villages and unmarked graves. The psychological toll on perpetrators was acknowledged by Nazi leadership, not as a moral concern, but as an operational problem to be managed, leading to adjustments such as rotating personnel, increasing alcohol rations, and experimenting with alternative killing methods that would reduce direct contact between executioner and victim. Yet despite these measures, the Einsatzgruppen continued their work relentlessly, driven by ideological conviction and reinforced by a command structure that rewarded compliance and punished hesitation. The invasion of the Soviet Union thus marked a decisive escalation in Nazi violence, transforming anti-Semitic policy from persecution and segregation into open, systematic mass murder carried out in broad daylight across thousands of locations. This phase of the Holocaust was decentralized and personal, relying on bullets rather than gas, proximity rather than distance, and it set a precedent that demonstrated both the feasibility and the limits of mass shooting as a tool of genocide. As the bodies accumulated and logistical challenges mounted, Nazi planners began to search for more industrialized solutions. But the Einsatzgruppen continued to operate throughout the war, leaving an indelible scar on the landscapes they passed through. Understanding this moment is essential because it reveals how quickly ideology translated into action once opportunity arose, and how the invasion of the East became not only a military campaign, but a crucible in which genocide was normalized, institutionalized, and expanded on a scale that would soon demand even more horrific innovations. Chapter 2, Segment 2, Mass Murder as Routine. As the summer of 1941 progressed, the Einsatzgruppen refined their methods until mass murder became a grim routine, executed with chilling regularity across occupied Eastern Europe, transforming genocide into a daily administrative task carried out alongside ordinary military operations. What had initially been framed as targeted actions against political enemies rapidly evolved into the systematic extermination of entire Jewish communities, with shootings conducted village by village, town by town, often announced through official notices ordering residents to assemble for registration, resettlement, or labor. These deceptions were deliberate, designed to minimize resistance and ensure compliance. And they worked with horrifying effectiveness as families arrived carrying documents, valuables, and children, unaware they were walking toward their own deaths. Once gathered, victims were marched under guard to execution sites carefully selected in advance. Forests, ravines, abandoned quarries, and natural depressions that would serve as mass graves, where they were ordered to surrender belongings, strip of clothing, and line up at the edge of pits already dug by forced laborers or the victims themselves. The shootings followed a standardized procedure meant to maximize efficiency. Victims were forced to lie face down or kneel at the pit's edge. Executioners fired single shots at close range, and bodies fell into the grave, layered one atop another, sometimes still moving, sometimes buried alive beneath the weight of others. Children were often shot last or killed in their mother's arms, a practice noted in reports without commentary, as if it were merely another logistical detail. These actions were carried out not only by SS officers but by ordinary policemen, reservists, and auxiliaries, many of whom had never killed before and yet adapted with alarming speed, aided by ideological indoctrination, peer pressure, alcohol, and the normalization of violence within the unit culture. Einsatzgruppen reports sent back to Berlin recorded these massacres with bureaucratic precision, listing dates, locations, and numbers killed, often categorized by Jews, communists, partisans, or others, reducing human annihilation to columns of data that senior officials reviewed as evidence of success. As the scale of killing increased, the Einsatzgruppen relied heavily on local collaborators, Lithuanian, Latvian, Ukrainian, and other auxiliary forces, who assisted in identifying Jewish residents, guarding prisoners, digging graves, and sometimes conducting shootings themselves, motivated by anti-Semitism, coercion, opportunism, or hopes of favor under German rule. This collaboration allowed the Einsatzgruppen to operate across vast territories with limited manpower, embedding genocide within local landscapes and social structures. Yet even as killing became routine, the psychological strain on perpetrators remained a concern for Nazi leadership, not because of moral qualms, but because emotional collapse, alcoholism, and indiscipline threatened operational efficiency. Heinrich Himmler himself witnessed a mass shooting near Minsk and reportedly reacted with visible distress, prompting efforts to develop methods that would distance executioners from the act of killing. Experiments with gas vans began during this period, in which victims were asphyxiated by engine exhaust during transport, foreshadowing the industrialized murder that would soon take shape in extermination camps. Still, throughout 1941 and into 1942, bullets remained the primary instrument of genocide in the East, and the Einsatzgruppen continued their work relentlessly, leaving behind landscapes scarred by unmarked graves and communities erased from history. Survivors, where any remained, spoke of silence after the shootings, of abandoned synagogues, empty streets, and the smell of disturbed earth, while perpetrators moved on to the next assignment, rarely punished, often commended. This normalization of mass murder stands as one of the most disturbing aspects of the Einsatzgruppen's operations, demonstrating how genocide can be integrated into everyday structures of authority and obedience, carried out by men who returned to meals, letters home, and routine duties after participating in acts of unimaginable cruelty. In this phase of the Holocaust, killing was not hidden behind walls or machinery, but unfolded openly in daylight, witnessed by soldiers, collaborators, and sometimes neighboring civilians, embedding terror into the fabric of occupied life, and proving that the path to industrial extermination was paved first with bullets, pits, and the steady erosion of moral boundaries. Chapter 2, Segment 3, From Bullets to Systems of Annihilation. By late 1941 and early 1942, the limitations and consequences of mass shooting operations forced the Nazi leadership to confront a problem of their own making. The Einsatzgruppen were killing at an unprecedented scale, yet the process was proving psychologically corrosive to the perpetrators, logistically inefficient for sustained extermination, and increasingly difficult to conceal as graves multiplied and rumors spread. Reports from commanders in the field noted rising alcoholism, nervous breakdowns, insubordination, and even suicides among men tasked with repeated executions, not out of remorse for victims, but from the relentless proximity to death and the physical intimacy of killing at close range. This concern, voiced most clearly by Heinrich Himmler and Reinhard Heydrich, did not slow the genocide, but accelerated its transformation, as Nazi planners searched for methods that would distance executioners from their victims while increasing the speed and secrecy of murder. It was during this transitional phase that gas vans, sealed trucks fitted with exhaust systems redirected into the cargo compartment, were deployed across occupied territories, particularly by Einsatzgruppen units and associated police battalions, allowing victims to be killed during transport, their deaths occurring out of sight, without gunfire, and with minimal direct contact. The introduction of these mobile killing units marked a crucial shift in the Holocaust's evolution, bridging the gap between decentralized shootings and the fixed extermination camps that would soon dominate the machinery of genocide. At the same time, the Einsatzgruppen continued their shootings unabated, often operating in tandem with new methods, clearing regions of Jewish populations while deportations to camps like Chelmno, Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka began under Operation Reinhard. This overlap underscores a critical truth. The Einsatzgruppen were not replaced by the camps. They laid the groundwork for them, proving that mass murder was feasible, administratively manageable, and ideologically acceptable within the Nazi system. Their reports, refined into statistical summaries, informed planners in Berlin of both successes and obstacles, shaping decisions about transportation networks, victim processing, and corpse disposal. As evidence accumulated, bloated graves surfacing, groundwater contamination, and the visible traces of massacres, the regime also initiated early concealment efforts, recognizing that even a victorious Reich would one day face questions. Orders were issued to exhume and burn bodies, erase execution sites, and silence witnesses, foreshadowing Operation 1005, which would later attempt to obliterate the physical evidence of mass shootings across Eastern Europe. Yet despite these efforts, the scale of the killings made total erasure impossible, and whispers of atrocities spread through occupied territories and beyond, carried by escaped witnesses, soldiers' letters, and the stunned silence of emptied towns. Within the Einsatzgruppen themselves, a hardened professional culture emerged, one that rewarded efficiency, obedience, and ideological commitment, while discouraging hesitation or dissent, creating an environment where moral resistance was not only rare but actively suppressed. Promotions, commendations, and career advancement followed those who demonstrated reliability in extermination tasks, embedding genocide into the structure of ambition and loyalty within the SS. By the time the death camps reached full operational capacity in 1942, the Einsatzgruppen had already murdered hundreds of thousands, if not over 1 million people, and had normalized the concept of total annihilation as state policy. Their legacy is inseparable from the camps that followed, because they proved that genocide could begin anywhere, on a forest edge, in a ravine, beside a village road, without industrial infrastructure, without secrecy, and without resistance from within the system meant to protect civilization. This segment of the Holocaust reveals not only how methods evolved, but how ideology, bureaucracy, and human compliance fused into a lethal engine, demonstrating that the path to Auschwitz was not a sudden descent, but a gradual, deliberate escalation, step by step, bullet by bullet, until murder itself became policy, routine, and expectation. Chapter 3, Segment 1, Invasion as License to Kill. When Operation Barbarossa began on June 22, 1941, it was not merely a military campaign, but a racial war deliberately framed as an existential struggle in which mercy was defined as weakness and extermination as necessity. And within this ideological framework, the Einsatzgruppen were unleashed with unprecedented authority. Following closely behind advancing Wehrmacht units into the vast territories of the Soviet Union, with the normal restraints of law, oversight, and even secrecy dissolved. almost overnight. The invasion was presented to German soldiers and police not as a conventional conflict between armies, but as a crusade against Judeo-Bolshevism, a fabricated enemy that fused Jews, communists, intellectuals, Roma, and anyone deemed racially or politically undesirable into a single target for annihilation. And this framing mattered profoundly because it transformed murder from a crime into a duty. Orders issued before the invasion explicitly authorized summary executions of Soviet political commissars, Communist Party members, and Jews in positions of influence. But these categories quickly expanded in practice as Einsatzgruppen commanders interpreted their mission with increasing breadth, often killing entire Jewish communities regardless of age, gender, or occupation. In towns and villages across Lithuania, Latvia, Belarus, Ukraine, and Western Russia, the arrival of German forces was followed almost immediately by roundups, interrogations, and mass shootings, often carried out within days or even hours, leaving little time for escape or resistance. Local collaboration played a crucial role in these early massacres, as auxiliary police units, nationalist militias, and civilians, some motivated by anti-Semitism, others by fear, revenge, or opportunism, assisted the Einsatzgruppen by identifying Jewish families, guarding victims, and sometimes participating directly in executions, giving the genocide a terrifyingly communal dimension. The killing sites themselves followed a grimly efficient pattern. Victims were assembled under false pretenses, marched to pre-selected locations such as forests, ravines, sandpits, or anti-tank ditches, ordered to undress, and then shot in groups, their bodies falling into mass graves prepared in advance, a method that required coordination, planning, and a chilling level of routine. One of the most infamous examples of this phase was the massacre at Babi, near Kiev in September 1941, where over 2 days Einsatzgruppen units, supported by police battalions and Wehrmacht personnel, murdered more than 33,000 Jewish men, women, and children, an operation that demonstrated both the capacity for industrial-scale killing without camps and the degree to which mass murder had become normalized within the Nazi system. Similar massacres occurred across Eastern Europe, often with less documentation but equal brutality, as entire shtetls vanished from the map, their histories erased in hours. The psychological atmosphere surrounding these killings was one of deliberate dehumanization, reinforced by propaganda, alcohol, peer pressure, and the hierarchical discipline of the SS, which discouraged refusal and framed participation as proof of loyalty and strength. While some perpetrators later claimed coercion or emotional distress, contemporary records reveal that many carried out their tasks with zeal, pride, or bureaucratic detachment, filing reports that reduced thousands of lives to numerical tallies, as if accounting for supplies rather than human beings. These reports, sent regularly to Berlin, were read, discussed, and archived, providing higher authorities with a clear picture of the genocide unfolding in real time and, crucially, with no meaningful attempt to stop it. The absence of intervention signaled approval, and approval emboldened further escalation, as Einsatzgruppen commanders competed to demonstrate effectiveness, expanding their targets to include women, children, the elderly, and eventually anyone with even the faintest association to Jewish identity or political descent. By the end of 1941, vast swaths of Eastern Europe had been transformed into landscapes of unmarked graves, their silence masking the speed and scale of the killings, while the perpetrators moved on, leaving behind emptied homes, abandoned synagogues, and communities that would never return. This phase of the Holocaust, carried out largely by bullets rather than gas, reveals a crucial and unsettling truth. Genocide did not require secrecy, distance, or technology to function. Only ideology, authority, and willing participants. And once those elements aligned, mass murder could unfold openly, efficiently, and with terrifying speed, laying the foundation for everything that would follow. Chapter 3, Segment 2, The Mechanics of Mass Murder. As the Einsatzgruppen advanced deeper into occupied Soviet territory throughout late 1941 and 1942, their operations evolved from improvised massacres into a grimly systematized process of mass murder, revealing how genocide adapts itself to scale, fatigue, and logistical necessity without ever questioning its purpose. What began as ad hoc shootings near towns soon became carefully organized killing actions, planned in advance with military precision, timed to coincide with troop movements, rail access, and local administrative cooperation, turning murder into a routine function of occupation. Einsatzgruppen units worked closely with order police battalions, Waffen-SS detachments, and local auxiliaries, dividing labor so that some units guarded victims, others carried out shootings, and others secured perimeters or disposed of belongings, creating a division of responsibility that diluted individual guilt while increasing efficiency. Victims were frequently deceived with false promises of resettlement, labor registration, or food distribution, a strategy designed not only to prevent resistance, but to preserve psychological distance for the perpetrators, who could maintain the illusion of order even as they orchestrated annihilation. At the killing sites, procedures became standardized. Valuables were confiscated, identity papers destroyed, clothing sorted for redistribution, and bodies arranged in pits according to methods such as sardine packing, where victims were forced to lie face down atop previous rows before being shot, a technique developed to maximize grave space and minimize ammunition use. These details, preserved in trial testimony and post-war investigations, reveal a chilling level of innovation devoted solely to making murder more efficient. As the scale of killing expanded, so too did the emotional and physical toll on the perpetrators, a problem that Nazi leadership addressed not by halting the violence, but by refining it. Alcohol rations were increased, rotations introduced, and psychological strain reframed as weakness to be overcome in service of a higher cause, reinforcing a culture in which moral resistance was equated with betrayal. Some commanders expressed concern not for the victims, but for the impact of prolonged shooting on their men, prompting discussions within SS leadership about alternative methods of killing that might reduce stress, discussions that would later influence the development of gas vans and extermination camps. Yet during this period, shootings remained the primary method, accounting for hundreds of thousands of deaths, often carried out in full view of local populations who were forced to witness, assist, or remain silent. The presence of civilians at or near execution sites further normalized the violence, embedding genocide into daily life and eroding the boundary between perpetrator and bystander. Children were not spared. They were shot alongside parents or murdered separately, sometimes tossed into graves alive, acts that even hardened killers later described as particularly disturbing, yet which continued nonetheless because ideology demanded total annihilation. Einsatzgruppen reports, known as Erinnerungsmeldungen UdSSR, meticulously recorded these operations, listing numbers killed by category, Jews, communists, partisans, without names, ages, or context, transforming human lives into abstract data points that could be discussed, compared, and praised at higher levels of command. These reports circulated among senior Nazi officials, including Himmler and Heydrich, ensuring that the leadership not only knew of the massacres, but actively monitored their progress, a fact that would later dismantle claims of ignorance during post-war trials. As months passed, the killing zones expanded geographically and demographically, engulfing rural areas that had initially been spared and targeting mixed families, converts, and even non-Jews accused of assisting Jews, revealing how the logic of extermination feeds on itself once unleashed. The Einsatzgruppen became both executioners and administrators of terror, enforcing compliance through fear while dismantling the social fabric of entire regions, leaving behind landscapes marked not by battle damage but by absence. Villages without inhabitants, cemeteries without names, memories severed from place. This phase of the Holocaust demonstrates that genocide is not a single event, but a process, one that evolves through repetition, normalization, and bureaucratic reinforcement, and it exposes a deeply unsettling reality. Mass murder can be made routine not because people lose their humanity entirely, but because systems are designed to suppress empathy, reward obedience, and redefine violence as necessity, allowing extraordinary evil to masquerade as ordinary work carried out day after day until millions are gone. Chapter 3, Segment 3, Witnesses, Silence, and the Normalization of Horror. As the Einsatzgruppen's campaign of mass murder continued, an equally devastating transformation unfolded alongside the physical destruction of communities. The gradual normalization of atrocity in the eyes of witnesses, perpetrators, and surrounding populations, creating a landscape where silence became as lethal as bullets. Across Eastern Europe, executions took place not in hidden camps but in open fields, forests, ravines, and village outskirts, often within earshot or sight of nearby homes, forcing civilians into a grim proximity with genocide that stripped away any illusion of secrecy. Local residents heard gunfire echo for hours, saw trucks filled with people pass one way and return empty, watched smoke rise from freshly covered pits, and encountered abandoned clothing, blood-soaked earth, and mass graves that no amount of official denial could erase. Some civilians were coerced into assisting, digging pits, transporting bodies, guarding victims, while others collaborated willingly, motivated by anti-Semitism, fear, opportunism, or the promise of stolen property, revealing how quickly moral boundaries collapse under authoritarian pressure and material incentive. Yet many simply stood by, paralyzed by terror, or convinced that survival depended on obedience and invisibility, illustrating how genocide feeds not only on hatred, but on the human instinct to endure at any cost. For the perpetrators, repetition bred familiarity, and familiarity bred emotional numbing, a process reinforced by the language used within the Einsatzgruppen themselves, where victims were reduced to units, loads, or special treatment, linguistic shields that allowed killers to distance themselves from the reality of their actions. Letters home from some Einsatzgruppen members reveal chilling contradictions, expressions of homesickness, concern for family, or pride in military service written alongside descriptions of mass shootings, demonstrating how compartmentalization enabled ordinary men to inhabit two moral worlds simultaneously. Nazi leadership encouraged this psychological division, framing the killings as unpleasant but necessary duties performed in defense of civilization, an ideological inversion that portrayed murderers as reluctant heroes burdened by responsibility rather than agents of annihilation. Over time, the killings became integrated into daily routines. Executions scheduled between meals, administrative meetings held near mass graves, and reports compiled immediately afterward, creating a rhythm in which death lost its shock value and became an expected outcome of occupation. Even the presence of children, whose murders often provoked discomfort among shooters, did not halt the process. Instead, procedures were adapted to complete the task more quickly, further evidence that the system's momentum outweighed individual conscience. The broader German military apparatus was not insulated from this reality, as Wehrmacht units frequently provided logistical support, secured perimeters, or turned over prisoners, blurring the post-war myth of a clean army and embedding genocide within conventional warfare. Meanwhile, the victims themselves were forced into impossible choices, some attempting to flee or hide, others clinging to hope that compliance might spare them, many recording their experiences in diaries, letters, or clandestine notes buried near execution sites, acts of testimony undertaken with the knowledge that survival was unlikely but memory still mattered. These fragments, later recovered by historians, serve as haunting counterpoints to Einsatzgruppen reports, restoring names, emotions, and individuality to those reduced to statistics. As news of the massacres spread through whispers and rumors, fear reshaped entire regions, silencing resistance while simultaneously radicalizing it, as some realized that submission offered no protection and that defiance, however futile, was the only remaining assertion of humanity. The psychological impact extended beyond the war years, embedding trauma into landscapes and generations, as survivors carried memories of screams, gunfire, and loss long after the perpetrators attempted to bury evidence and deny responsibility. This phase of the Holocaust reveals a critical truth. Genocide does not require secrecy to function. It requires normalization, repetition, and the gradual erosion of moral shock, until acts that once seemed unimaginable become routine tasks performed under orders, observed by neighbors, and absorbed into the background of daily life. The Einsatzgruppen did not operate in isolation. They functioned within a human environment that, through fear, ideology, or indifference, allowed mass murder to unfold in plain sight, reminding us that the greatest danger is not only hatred itself, but the moment when society learns to look away, accept the unacceptable, and continue on as if nothing extraordinary is happening, even as entire worlds are being erased. Chapter 4, Segment 1, From Bullets to Industry, The Limits of Mass Shooting. By late 1941, as the Einsatzgruppen continued their relentless advance across occupied Eastern Europe, the Nazi leadership began to confront a grim and revealing reality. Mass murder by rifle, carried out face to face, village by village, was proving both psychologically destabilizing for the perpetrators and logistically inefficient for the scale of genocide they envisioned. Reports from the field, while meticulous in their accounting of victims, increasingly referenced exhaustion, declining morale, alcoholism, and even breakdowns among the men tasked with killing thousands of civilians at close range, day after day. Heinrich Himmler himself witnessed an execution near Minsk and reportedly turned away in visible distress, an episode that underscored a contradiction at the heart of Nazi ideology: the desire to annihilate entire populations while preserving the emotional discipline and obedience of those ordered to do the killing. The solution was not to stop, but to refine. Nazi planners sought methods that would distance the executioner from the victim, reduce psychological resistance, and accelerate the pace of death, transforming genocide from a series of localized massacres into a centralized, mechanized process. This transition did not replace the Einsatzgruppen overnight, but it marked a decisive evolution in the architecture of mass murder. Experiments with gas vans, sealed trucks into which engine exhaust was redirected, were introduced in occupied Poland and the Soviet territories, allowing victims to be killed during transport rather than by firing squads, a method praised in internal correspondence for sparing shooters the trauma of direct violence. These mobile gas chambers represented a bridge between the decentralized killings of the Einsatzgruppen and the fixed extermination camps that would soon follow, demonstrating how technological innovation was applied not for efficiency of life, but for efficiency of death. The logic driving this shift was chillingly bureaucratic. Fewer bullets expended, fewer witnesses, faster disposal of bodies, and less emotional strain on personnel, all in service of an ideological goal that had already accepted murder as policy. As the Einsatzgruppen continued their operations, they increasingly worked in tandem with other branches of the SS, police battalions, and camp administrations, feeding victims into a widening network of destruction that stretched from remote ravines to newly constructed killing centers. This period reveals that the Holocaust was not a static plan executed flawlessly from the start, but a radicalizing process in which methods were tested, evaluated, and improved based on experience, feedback, and perceived obstacles. The suffering of victims was never a deterrent. Rather, it was the discomfort of perpetrators that prompted procedural change. Yet even as extermination camps like Chelmno, Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka came online, the Einsatzgruppen did not fade into irrelevance. They continued mass shootings deep into 1942 and beyond, particularly in areas where camps were not yet operational or where speed and terror were deemed tactically useful. Forests and ravines remained killing grounds. Bullets still tore through families, and bodies continued to be buried in mass graves, often later exhumed and burned under Operation 1005 to erase evidence of the crimes. What changed was not the intent, but the scale and coordination as genocide became increasingly industrialized, drawing on rail systems, administrative hierarchies, and specialized units to sustain killing on an unprecedented level. This chapter in the Einsatzgruppen story exposes one of the most disturbing truths of the Holocaust. Mass murder was not only an act of hatred, but an adaptive system, capable of evolving in response to logistical challenges, psychological limits, and strategic goals. The transition from bullets to gas did not mark a moral boundary, but a technical one, illustrating how a regime committed to racial annihilation would continuously refine its methods to ensure that nothing, neither conscience nor inefficiency, stood in the way of its vision. Chapter 4, Segment 2, The Bureaucracy of Killing, Orders, Reports, and Moral Collapse. As the Einsatzgruppen operations intensified, mass murder became not only an act carried out in fields and forests, but a process meticulously recorded, categorized, and transmitted through layers of Nazi bureaucracy, revealing how genocide was normalized through paperwork and procedure. Each unit was required to submit detailed situation reports, Meldungen, listing the number of people executed, broken down by categories such as Jews, Roma, communist officials, partisans, and suspected elements, transforming human lives into numerical achievements evaluated by superiors in Berlin. These reports flowed upward through the RSHA, where Reinhard Heydrich and his deputies analyzed them not with horror, but with strategic interest, using the data to assess progress, identify inefficiencies, and issue refinements to killing operations. Language played a crucial role in this moral erosion. Victims are described as cleansed, processed, or eliminated, while executions were framed as security measures, allowing perpetrators to distance themselves psychologically from the reality of their actions. This bureaucratic framing enabled thousands of men, clerks, drivers, translators, radio operators, and officers to participate in genocide without ever firing a weapon, yet remaining essential to its execution. Orders descended through a rigid chain of command, often couched in vague phrasing that encouraged initiative while maintaining plausible deniability, creating a system where responsibility was diffused and accountability obscured. Field commanders understood the expectations without requiring explicit written directives. The ideological climate made the goal unmistakable, even when specific instructions were left deliberately ambiguous. Within the Einsatzgruppen ranks, dissent was rare, not because refusal was impossible, but because conformity was rewarded and deviation discouraged through peer pressure, indoctrination, and career advancement. Men who expressed discomfort were often reassigned quietly, while those who demonstrated efficiency and initiative gained promotions, reinforcing a culture where moral restraint was perceived as weakness. Alcohol became widespread, used to dull the psychological impact of repeated killings, further entrenching cycles of dependency and brutality. Meanwhile, local collaborators, police auxiliaries, militias, and civilians were incorporated into operations, expanding the killing apparatus while allowing German units to maintain distance from some executions, spreading culpability across entire societies fractured by occupation and fear. The bureaucratic system also facilitated coordination with other Nazi agencies, ensuring that deportations, property seizures, forced labor, and executions were synchronized parts of a single genocidal strategy. Homes were emptied, belongings cataloged, valuables confiscated, and survivors herded into ghettos or camps, all recorded with the same administrative precision as tax records or census data. This mechanization of cruelty illustrates how the Holocaust was not solely the product of fanatical killers, but of institutional structures that transformed ideology into routine governance. The Einsatzgruppen were both executioners and administrators of terror, operating within a system that rewarded obedience, punished empathy, and redefined mass murder as a professional obligation. By embedding killing within bureaucratic norms, the Nazi regime ensured that genocide could continue even as individuals came and went, making the process resilient, scalable, and terrifyingly efficient. This segment exposes one of the most unsettling lessons of history: that atrocities of unimaginable scale do not require constant rage or chaos, but can unfold quietly, methodically, and legally when a state reorients its moral framework and turns its administrative machinery toward destruction. Chapter 4, Segment 3, The Human Cost Behind the Numbers, Trauma, Silence, and the Shattered Witnesses. Behind every report filed by the Einsatzgruppen, behind every column of numbers and sanitized euphemisms, existed a reality that could not be fully contained by language. The profound human devastation inflicted not only on the victims, but on the witnesses, bystanders, collaborators, and even the perpetrators themselves, many of whom carried psychological scars long after the gunfire stopped. Survivors who escaped mass executions described landscapes transformed into open graves, forests that seemed to breathe with buried bodies, and ravines where the earth moved days later from trapped survivors suffocating beneath layers of corpses. Children who survived by hiding under dead relatives emerged into a world stripped of family, identity, and safety, carrying memories that would haunt them for decades in silence. Local civilians, forced to watch or assist under threat of death, became unwilling witnesses to atrocities that fractured entire communities, leaving behind a legacy of guilt, fear, and moral injury that persisted long after liberation. The Einsatzgruppen killings were public enough to be seen, heard, and smelled, gunshots echoing for hours, blood seeping into soil, and the stench of death lingering in villages, ensuring that terror spread far beyond the execution sites themselves. For many perpetrators, especially those involved in prolonged operations, the psychological toll manifested in alcoholism, nightmares, emotional numbness, and violent behavior, though these symptoms rarely translated into remorse or resistance. Instead, they reinforced detachment and dehumanization. Nazi leadership interpreted such psychological strain not as a moral warning, but as an operational problem, leading to discussions about burden reduction, which directly contributed to the development of more impersonal killing methods, including gas vans and, later, extermination camps. In this way, the emotional suffering of the killers paradoxically accelerated the evolution of industrialized murder, prioritizing efficiency and distance over human consequence. Meanwhile, Jewish communities trapped in the path of the Einsatzgruppen experienced a collapse of time itself. Life reduced to hours, days, or minutes, forcing impossible decisions as families debated whether to flee, hide, resist, or cling to the hope that compliance might mean survival. Religious leaders struggled to provide spiritual comfort in a world where faith seemed mocked by systematic annihilation. Yet many continued to pray, teach, and document events even as death approached, preserving testimony for a future they knew they would not see. These hidden diaries, buried notes, and whispered accounts would later become some of the most powerful evidence of what occurred, standing in stark contrast to the cold official reports produced by the perpetrators. After the war, silence often replaced testimony, as survivors encountered disbelief, indifference, or political pressure to move on, while many perpetrators reintegrated into society with minimal consequences, their crimes obscured by the scale of destruction and the chaos of post-war reconstruction. The psychological aftermath of the Einsatzgruppen massacres thus extended far beyond the war years, shaping memory, identity, and trauma across generations. This segment reveals that genocide is not only measured in death counts, but in the enduring damage inflicted on human consciousness itself. The loss of trust, the distortion of morality, and the lingering question of how ordinary people became capable of witnessing, enabling, or committing such acts. By confronting these human consequences, we are forced to recognize that the Einsatzgruppen did not merely destroy lives in the moment. They fractured the moral fabric of entire regions, leaving wounds that history still struggles to heal, and reminding us that the cost of genocide is never confined to the past. Chapter 5, Segment 1, From Bullets to Bureaucracy, How the Einsatzgruppen Systematized Mass Murder. As the Einsatzgruppen campaigns expanded across Eastern Europe, what began as localized killing operations rapidly evolved into a bureaucratic system of annihilation, one that fused ideology, logistics, and administrative discipline into a machine designed to erase entire populations with chilling efficiency. And this transformation marked a decisive turning point in the Holocaust itself. Early massacres had been improvised, brutal, and often chaotic, relying on direct shootings that strained manpower and morale. Yet by late 1941 Nazi leadership, particularly figures like Heinrich Himmler and Reinhard Heydrich, recognized that mass murder required structure, documentation, and coordination on an unprecedented scale. Orders flowed downward through meticulously crafted chains of command, translating abstract racial doctrine into precise operational instructions that specified targets, quotas, and reporting procedures. Einsatzgruppen units were subdivided into smaller detachments to cover wider territories, coordinating with local police, auxiliary forces, and Wehrmacht units to identify Jewish communities, political enemies, Roma populations, and other groups marked for extermination. Killing sites were selected strategically: forests, ravines, sand pits, places that could conceal bodies while remaining accessible by road, turning geography itself into a tool of genocide. Each operation followed a grimly standardized pattern. Victims were assembled under false pretenses, stripped of valuables, marched to execution sites, forced to undress, and shot in systematic waves, with reports later compiled into dry numerical summaries that masked horror behind administrative language. These Einsatzgruppen reports, sent to Berlin, reduced human lives to statistics. 1,137 Jews liquidated, 2,034 executions completed, and were circulated among senior officials as evidence of progress toward ideological goals. The bureaucratic normalization of murder allowed perpetrators to distance themselves psychologically from their actions, transforming genocide into a professional task measured by efficiency rather than morality. Over time, logistical refinements were introduced to accelerate killing and minimize disruption. Pre-dug pits, rotational firing squads, alcohol rations for executioners, and schedules designed to process thousands of victims in a single day. Local collaborators were increasingly conscripted to assist with roundups and guard duties, further embedding genocide within occupied societies and dispersing responsibility across countless individuals. This diffusion of guilt made accountability more elusive and ensured that mass murder could continue even when central oversight was limited. Meanwhile, Nazi administrators evaluated the costs of shooting operations, not in human terms, but in ammunition usage, manpower fatigue, and psychological impact on troops. Discussions that chillingly framed genocide as an efficiency problem rather than a moral crime. These assessments directly informed the later transition to extermination camps equipped with gas chambers. But even before those facilities reached full operation, the Einsatzgruppen had already demonstrated how murder could be organized on an industrial scale without factories. The administrative mindset that governed these operations represented a profound collapse of ethical reasoning, replacing conscience with procedure and obedience with responsibility. Ordinary clerks typed reports detailing mass executions. Officers signed orders scheduling death, and drivers transported victims as if moving cargo, all participating in a system that transformed genocide into routine work. This segment exposes how the Einsatzgruppen were not merely roaming killers, but components of a coordinated state apparatus that fused modern bureaucracy with ancient hatred, proving that the greatest atrocities are often carried out not in moments of chaos, but through calm, methodical organization. By examining this shift from raw violence to administrative mass murder, we confront a disturbing truth. Genocide does not require madness. It requires structure, compliance, and a system willing to treat human beings as numbers on a page. Chapter 5, Segment 2, Operation 1005, Digging Up the Dead and Erasing the Evidence. As the scale of the Einsatzgruppen massacres grew, so too did a new and deeply unsettling realization within Nazi leadership. The ground itself was beginning to tell the truth. By late 1941 and early 1942, mass graves across Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania, Latvia, and Poland were no longer hidden secrets buried in forests and ravines. They were leaking, collapsing, and revealing the enormity of what had taken place, and the fear that these graves would one day testify against the Reich triggered one of the most grotesque chapters of the Holocaust. This response became known as Operation 1005, a systematic effort to exhume, destroy, and erase the physical evidence of mass murder carried out by the Einsatzgruppen. Under direct orders from Heinrich Himmler and overseen by SS officer Paul Blobel, himself a former Einsatzgruppen commander, special units were formed to revisit execution sites months or even years after the killings. These units forced prisoners, often Jews taken from nearby ghettos or camps, to dig up decomposing bodies with their bare hands, stack them on a massive pyres made of railroad tracks and timber, and burn them day and night until nothing remained but ash and bone fragments. The stench of decay hung over entire regions, a sickening reminder that the land could not forget what had been done to it. Survivors later described the unimaginable horror of recognizing relatives among the dead, their bodies fused together by time, earth, and decay, while SS guards stood watch, beating prisoners who slowed or collapsed from exhaustion. Once the corpses were burned, remaining bones were crushed with hammers or ground into powder, then scattered into rivers, fields, or reburied in shallow pits designed to vanish into the landscape. After the work was completed, the prisoners themselves were executed to ensure no witnesses survived, turning Operation 1005 into a closed loop of annihilation. This was not an act of remorse or moral reckoning. It was an admission of guilt disguised as logistical necessity, a calculated attempt to rewrite reality itself. Nazi officials understood that mass murder on this scale could not remain hidden forever, and Operation 1005 represented a desperate effort to outrun history, to ensure that when investigators arrived, they would find only empty forests and silent fields. Yet even as they labored to erase the dead, the Einsatzgruppen and their successors continued killing, a contradiction that revealed the regime's deepening paranoia and moral collapse. The operation also exposed the psychological toll of genocide on its perpetrators. SS commanders complained about the mental strain on troops tasked with burning bodies, leading to increased alcohol distribution and rotational assignments, measures intended not to reduce cruelty, but to sustain it. Documents related to Operation 1005 were deliberately vague, cloaked in euphemisms like special treatment and sanitation, yet their intent was unmistakable: to destroy the truth. Despite these efforts, the operation ultimately failed. Ashes remained in the soil. Bone fragments surfaced after rains. Witnesses escaped. Survivors remembered. And when Allied forces later uncovered these sites, forensic investigators and historians pieced together what the Nazis had tried to erase. Operation 1005 stands as one of the most chilling confirmations of the Einsatzgruppen's crimes, proving that even those who carried out genocide understood its monstrous nature well enough to attempt to hide it. In trying to erase the dead, they instead left behind a deeper stain, one that history would not and could not forget. Chapter 5, Segment 3, Judgment Without Closure, Trials, Denial, and the Burden of Memory. When the guns finally fell silent and the Third Reich collapsed, the forests and ravines of Eastern Europe did not exhale relief. They remained heavy with unanswered questions, unmarked graves, and a truth so vast it resisted comprehension. And it was into this moral wreckage that investigators, prosecutors, and survivors stepped in the immediate aftermath of the war, attempting to impose justice on crimes that had been designed to leave no witnesses. The Einsatzgruppen, whose murders numbered in the hundreds of thousands before the extermination camps reached full operation, became central to this reckoning, yet the path toward accountability was slow, uneven, and deeply flawed. At the International Military Tribunal in Nuremberg, the mobile killing units were recognized as instruments of genocide, but many of their leaders had already vanished, killed in battle, executed by their own side, or absorbed into the chaos of a defeated Europe. It was not until 1947 to 1948 that a dedicated legal effort emerged in the form of the Einsatzgruppen trial, one of the subsequent Nuremberg proceedings conducted by U.S. military courts. 14 senior SS and police officials stood accused of crimes against humanity, war crimes, and membership in criminal organizations, and for the first time, the methodical mechanics of mass shootings were laid bare in court through documents, orders, and chilling testimony. Defendants attempted to shield themselves behind obedience, claiming they had merely followed orders from higher authorities, invoking fear of punishment, loyalty to the state, or the chaos of wartime conditions. But prosecutors dismantled these defenses by demonstrating the voluntary zeal with which many commanders executed their mission, often escalating brutality beyond written directives. The verdicts were severe: 14 death sentences, 2 life imprisonments, and lesser terms for others. Yet even these judgments felt insufficient when measured against the scale of the crimes. Beyond the courtroom walls, a larger failure unfolded. Thousands of Einsatzgruppen members were never tried at all. In the early Cold War years, political priorities shifted, denazification programs were softened, and former SS men quietly reintegrated into post-war society, some becoming civil servants, businessmen, or neighbors whose past remained unspoken. In West Germany especially, investigations dragged on for decades, hampered by legal technicalities, fading memories, destroyed records, and a society reluctant to confront its own participation. Survivors watched as perpetrators lived freely, married, raised children, and aged into anonymity, while entire families they had erased remained only as names in archives or ashes in the soil. The psychological violence of this imbalance between suffering remembered and crimes forgotten became its own continuation of harm. Yet memory refused to die. Historians painstakingly reconstructed massacre sites. Forensic teams exhumed remains despite earlier Nazi attempts at erasure, and survivor testimonies, fragile, fragmented, but unyielding, filled the gaps left by destroyed documents. The Einsatzgruppen came to symbolize a terrifying truth. Genocide does not require factories or camps to begin. It can be carried out by men with rifles, paperwork, and the permission to dehumanize. Their legacy forced a redefinition of responsibility, expanding it beyond leaders and architects to include ordinary individuals who chose participation over resistance. In classrooms, memorials, and courtrooms, the story of the Einsatzgruppen now stands as a warning about how quickly morality collapses when hatred is normalized and obedience replaces conscience. Justice, when it came, was incomplete, delayed, and uneven, but remembrance became its own form of reckoning. Each name recovered, each grave identified, each testimony preserved stands in quiet defiance of the killer's intent, affirming that while the Einsatzgruppen sought to erase lives and history itself, the truth endured, carried forward not by power or vengeance, but by memory, and by the insistence that even crimes committed in silence will one day be heard. Chapter 6, Segment 1. The Weight Carried Forward, Silence, Trauma, and the Survivors Who Lived with What the World Could Not See. Long after the Einsatzgruppen disappeared from the roads and forests of Eastern Europe, their presence lingered in ways that statistics and trial transcripts could never fully explain, settling instead into the lives of those who survived by chance, concealment, or sheer endurance, and into landscapes that had absorbed violence so thoroughly they seemed to remember it themselves. For survivors, liberation did not bring an end to suffering, but a new and often lonelier chapter, defined by trauma that had no language, grief that had no rituals, and memories that arrived uninvited in dreams, sounds, and sudden silences. Many had watched their families murdered in front of them, hidden beneath corpses in mass graves, or fled into forests knowing that discovery meant immediate death. And when the war ended, these experiences were met not with understanding but with disbelief, discomfort, or a world eager to move on. In displaced persons camps, survivors struggled to explain killings that had occurred not in infamous camps, but in fields near their homes, places that neighbors passed every day without markers or acknowledgement, and this invisibility compounded the pain, as if the dead had been erased twice, first by bullets, then by forgetting. Children who survived grew into adults, carrying memories they barely understood, shaped by fear learned too early and a sense of loss, so complete it felt like an absence of gravity, while adults wrestled with survivors' guilt, questioning why they had lived when parents, siblings, and entire communities had not. The Einsatzgruppen massacres also left deep scars on the societies that had witnessed them. often in silence. Villagers who had heard shots from nearby forests, seen trucks pass at dawn and return empty, or watched Jews marched away never to return, carried their own burdens of fear, complicity, and denial. And in many regions, post-war narratives smoothed over these moments, framing them as distant atrocities rather than events that unfolded within sight and sound of ordinary life. This collective repression shaped national memories for decades, delaying honest confrontation and leaving survivors isolated within their own histories. Psychologists and historians would later recognize that the nature of the Einsatzgruppen killings, intimate, public, and swift, created a unique form of trauma, one rooted not only in violence, but in the collapse of trust as neighbors, officials, and even former classmates became witnesses, participants, or beneficiaries of disappearance. Unlike the camps, which became fixed symbols of evil, the mobile massacres were scattered across thousands of locations, making commemoration fragmented and inconsistent. And for many families, the absence of graves or certainty meant mourning without closure, rituals without bodies, and names remembered without places to visit. Yet despite this weight, survivors found ways to live, rebuild, and speak, often decades later, when the world finally began to ask the right questions. Testimonies recorded in the late 20th century reveal voices still trembling but determined, describing forests that seemed endless, the sound of soil falling on bodies, and the unbearable knowledge that entire lineages ended in a single afternoon. And these accounts transformed the historical understanding of genocide, shifting focus from abstract numbers to human experience. Memory initiatives, memorial stones, and education programs slowly emerged, marking ravines and fields with names and stories, not to reopen wounds, but to acknowledge that what happened there mattered, and that survival itself was a form of resistance against the killer's goal of total erasure. In carrying their stories forward, survivors challenged a world that had once ignored them, insisting that the legacy of the Einsatzgruppen was not only one of death, but also of testimony, endurance, and the moral obligation to remember, even when remembrance is painful, incomplete, and heavy, because forgetting would mean allowing the silence the killers depended on to finally succeed. Chapter 6, Segment 2, Justice After the Graves, Trials, Denial, and the Long Struggle to Name the Crime. When the guns finally fell silent and the Einsatzgruppen vanished into defeat, the question of justice emerged slowly and unevenly, burdened by political priorities, limited evidence, and a world exhausted by war. Yet the magnitude of the crimes committed in forests and ravines demanded recognition, even as many perpetrators attempted to disappear back into ordinary life. Unlike the extermination camps, which left behind ruins, documents, and survivors in concentrated locations, the mobile killings were diffuse and deliberately concealed, their traces buried under soil, burned bodies, and intimidated witnesses, making accountability difficult and, for many years, incomplete. The first major attempt to confront these crimes came during the Nuremberg trials, where the Einsatzgruppen were identified not as rogue units, but as instruments of state policy, acting under orders that explicitly targeted civilians for annihilation. In the subsequent Einsatzgruppen trial of 1947 to 1948, 14 commanders were sentenced to death and 4 to imprisonment. A landmark moment that established genocide as a prosecutable crime, even when carried out far from camps and without industrial infrastructure. Yet these trials represented only a fraction of those responsible. Thousands of shooters, drivers, guards, and administrators were never charged, their actions obscured by the chaos of war's end, Cold War politics, and a widespread reluctance within post-war Germany and occupied territories to reopen wounds that implicated local populations. Many perpetrators reintegrated into civilian life, becoming clerks, teachers, businessmen, and officials, while survivors watched with disbelief as those who had participated in mass murder lived freely, sometimes in the same towns where killings had occurred. This imbalance between crime and consequence fostered a culture of denial and minimization, reinforced by narratives that framed the Holocaust primarily through camps while sidelining the early, open-air massacres that had already destroyed hundreds of thousands of lives by the end of 1941. In Eastern Europe, Soviet authorities emphasized Nazi guilt but suppressed Jewish specificity, folding Einsatzgruppen victims into a generalized narrative of wartime suffering. While in the West, attention shifted toward rebuilding and geopolitical rivalry, leaving little space for the painstaking work of local investigation. It was not until the 1960s and later that renewed efforts, driven by historians, journalists, and a younger generation unwilling to accept silence, began to expose the scale of the mobile killings, uncovering mass graves, collecting testimonies, and documenting orders that demonstrated systematic intent. These revelations challenged comfortable myths, forcing societies to confront not only German perpetrators, but also collaborators who had assisted, informed, or profited from the destruction of their neighbors. Legal proceedings resumed in some countries, but sentences were often light, constrained by statutes of limitation, claims of obedience, or courts unwilling to impose severe punishment decades after the fact, a reality that left many survivors feeling that justice had arrived too late or not at all. Still, the trials that did occur mattered, not only for their verdicts, but for the historical record they created, preserving evidence that countered denial and distortion. As denialism emerged in fringe movements, attempting to cast doubt on mass shootings or reduce them to exaggerated claims, the documented work of investigators and courts became a bulwark against falsehood, affirming that these crimes were real, intentional, and unprecedented in scale. The struggle to name the Einsatzgruppen's actions as genocide was part of a broader effort to define international law itself, influencing conventions on crimes against humanity and shaping how future atrocities would be judged. Justice, in this context, was never complete, but it evolved from punishment alone into remembrance, education, and moral reckoning, acknowledging that while courts could sentence individuals, only sustained memory could address the deeper harm inflicted on humanity. In confronting the Einsatzgruppen through trials, archives, and testimony, the post-war world began a slow and imperfect process of reckoning, one that revealed how easily mass murder could be rationalized, how long its consequences could endure, and how fragile justice becomes when silence, fear, and convenience are allowed to outweigh truth. Chapter 6, Segment 3, Memory Without Graves. How the Einsatzgruppen are remembered today. As the decades passed and the generation that witnessed the Einsatzgruppen firsthand began to fade, the responsibility for remembrance shifted from survivors to historians, educators, and memorial institutions tasked with preserving a crime that left few visible monuments and no iconic structures to anchor public memory. Unlike Auschwitz or Treblinka, where gates, barracks, and crematoria stand as permanent reminders, the killing fields of the Einsatzgruppen were forests, fields, quarries, and ravines, places that returned to silence after the gunfire stopped, often unmarked, sometimes built over, and in many cases deliberately forgotten. For years, entire villages lived atop mass graves without markers, while children played where their grandparents had been murdered, unaware of what lay beneath the soil. It was only through persistent research, survivor testimony, and forensic investigation that many of these sites were rediscovered, identified not by stone monuments, but by memory itself, fragile and contested. Organizations and scholars began mapping execution sites, reconstructing timelines, and recording testimonies before they disappeared, creating an archive of evidence that transformed scattered killings into a comprehensible historical narrative. This work revealed that the Einsatzgruppen were not an isolated aberration, but a central mechanism of the Holocaust, responsible for the systematic murder of Jewish communities that had existed for centuries across Eastern Europe. Museums and memorials gradually incorporated this reality, expanding Holocaust education beyond camps to include the mass shootings, emphasizing that genocide did not begin with gas chambers, but with neighbors being marched into woods and shot in front of one another. In places like Babi, Rumbula, and Ponary, memorials now stand where silence once reigned. Yet even these markers often came decades late and after intense political struggle, reflecting ongoing tensions over how history is acknowledged. In some regions, remembrance remains contested, complicated by national narratives that resist acknowledging collaboration or downplay anti-Semitic violence, while denial and distortion persist in fringe movements that exploit the absence of physical ruins to sow doubt. Against this, education has become the most powerful tool of remembrance, using documented orders, photographs, and testimonies to demonstrate that the Einsatzgruppen were not rumors or exaggerations, but carefully organized units acting with bureaucratic precision and ideological conviction. The legacy of their crimes has influenced international law, shaping how genocide is defined and prosecuted, and serving as a warning that mass murder does not require advanced technology or hidden facilities, only obedience, hatred, and a system that rewards compliance. For descendants of victims, remembrance is not abstract. It is personal and unfinished, tied to names without graves and communities erased so thoroughly that only records remain. For descendants of perpetrators, it raises uncomfortable questions about inheritance, responsibility, and the ease with which ordinary lives can coexist with extraordinary crimes. Today, the story of the Einsatzgruppen stands as one of the clearest examples of how genocide can unfold in plain sight, carried out by men who returned home after their workday and recorded their killings in reports typed with administrative calm. Remembering them is not about fascination with cruelty, but about understanding how civilization can fracture when ideology overrides humanity, when language dehumanizes, and when silence allows violence to normalize itself. In preserving the history of the Einsatzgruppen, the world confronts not only the past, but a mirror reflecting the dangers that arise whenever hatred is sanctioned, obedience is valued over conscience, and the lives of others are reduced to statistics. Their legacy endures not in ruins, but in lessons written into law, memory, and moral responsibility, reminding us that genocide begins long before the Earth's shot is fired, and that remembrance is the final defense against its return. Chapter 7, Segment 1, The Psychological Machinery of Mass Murder. What distinguished the Einsatzgruppen from other instruments of Nazi terror was not only what they did, but how they were able to do it repeatedly, systematically, and often without visible coercion, revealing a psychological machinery as lethal as any weapon they carried. These men were not selected because they were sadists or criminals. Many were educated, middle-class Germans, lawyers, teachers, clerks, and policemen who had internalized a worldview in which murder became framed as duty, necessity, and even moral obligation. The ideological preparation began long before the first execution, shaped by years of propaganda that portrayed Jews, communists, Roma, and others as existential threats rather than human beings, reducing individuals to abstractions that could be eliminated without remorse. Language played a central role in this process, transforming killing into special treatment, mass graves into security measures, and entire communities into problems requiring solutions, allowing perpetrators to distance themselves emotionally from their actions. Orders were delivered through formal chains of command, wrapped in bureaucratic language that stripped violence of its immediacy, while reports meticulously recorded body counts with the precision of accounting ledgers, reinforcing the idea that success was measured numerically rather than morally. Group dynamics further entrenched participation, as refusal was rare not because it was punished severely, but because conformity, loyalty, and fear of social exclusion proved powerful motivators within tightly structured units. Men watched one another, gauging acceptable behavior, learning quickly that compliance was rewarded with approval and advancement, while hesitation marked one as unreliable. Alcohol was often used to dull senses and lower inhibitions, turning executions into grim routines rather than singular moral crises, while rotation systems ensured that responsibility was shared, diffused, and therefore easier to bear. Over time, repeated exposure normalized brutality, shifting internal boundaries until acts that once provoked shock became procedural tasks performed between meals and paperwork. Yet cracks appeared beneath this surface of efficiency, visible in letters home that hinted at emotional strain, in medical reports describing nervous breakdowns, and in testimonies where former Einsatzgruppen members later admitted to nightmares, guilt, and psychological collapse. These symptoms did not stop the killings, but they reveal that participation required constant psychological reinforcement, sustained by ideology, authority, and collective silence. The system did not rely on inherent cruelty alone, but on the gradual erosion of moral resistance, demonstrating how environments structured around obedience can transform ordinary people into perpetrators of extraordinary crimes. This dynamic challenges the comforting belief that genocide is carried out only by monsters, forcing a confrontation with the unsettling reality that under certain conditions, individuals can be guided step by step toward actions they might once have considered unthinkable. The Einsatzgruppen thus represent not only a historical atrocity, but a case study in human behavior, showing how power, belief, and social pressure can align to override empathy and conscience. Understanding this psychological machinery is essential not to excuse the perpetrators, but to dismantle the myths that distance modern societies from the past, reminding us that the line between civilization and barbarity is not fixed, but fragile, dependent on vigilance, ethical courage, and a willingness to resist when authority demands the inhuman. Chapter 7, Segment 2, Complicity, Silence, and the World That Looked Away. While the Einsatzgruppen carried out their massacres with rifles and shovels, their ability to operate on such a scale depended not only on the men who pulled the triggers, but on the vast web of complicity, indifference, and silence that surrounded them, extending far beyond the execution sites themselves. Local collaborators played a crucial role, as auxiliary police units, militias, and civilian informants across Ukraine, Lithuania, Latvia, Belarus, and other occupied regions assisted in identifying Jewish families, guarding victims, digging pits, and sometimes participating directly in the killings, motivated by anti-Semitism, opportunism, fear, or the hope of personal gain. In many towns, neighbors watched as people they had known for years were marched away, their homes looted before their bodies were cold, creating a chilling environment where survival often depended on remaining invisible and silent. German military units, though not formally part of the Einsatzgruppen, were frequently aware of the massacres occurring near their positions, hearing gunfire echo through forests and ravines, encountering mass graves, or receiving logistical support requests, yet rarely intervening, reinforcing a culture in which the extermination of civilians was treated as a background operation rather than a moral emergency. Even within the German administration, knowledge of the killings circulated through reports, briefings, and statistics sent to Berlin, where senior officials read detailed accounts of tens of thousands murdered in single operations, acknowledging the reality while focusing on efficiency, coordination, and expansion rather than human cost. Beyond the front lines, information about mass shootings did reach the outside world through diplomats, resistance networks, and early intelligence reports, but the sheer scale and brutality of the crimes were often dismissed as exaggeration or wartime propaganda, allowing governments to delay action while millions continued to die. The Nazi leadership exploited this hesitation, understanding that denial, disbelief, and bureaucratic inertia were powerful allies, enabling the Einsatzgruppen to function with little fear of immediate accountability. Silence also operated at the level of language and memory, as entire communities vanished from maps and records, their absence normalized through administrative erasure. While stolen property was redistributed, houses reassigned, and streets renamed, creating a false sense of continuity over spaces marked by mass death. For survivors who witnessed these events, the trauma was compounded by isolation, as attempts to warn others were often met with disbelief, and escape routes closed one by one, trapping families between hope and terror. This environment of widespread complicity and passivity did not mean that resistance was impossible, but it made resistance extraordinarily dangerous and rare, requiring moral courage that few possessed and even fewer survived. The Einsatzgruppen thrived in this landscape, not simply because they were ordered to kill, but because they operated within a system that rewarded obedience, punished dissent, and normalized atrocity through routine and repetition. Understanding this broader context is essential because it reveals that genocide is not sustained by perpetrators alone, but by the surrounding society's failure to intervene, question, or disrupt the machinery of destruction. The story of the Einsatzgruppen therefore implicates not only the men who committed the shootings, but also the institutions, communities, and governments that allowed the killing to continue unchecked, demonstrating how silence can become an accomplice to murder. This uncomfortable truth challenges the notion that responsibility lies solely with those at the center of violence, reminding us that moral collapse often unfolds gradually through countless small decisions to look away, remain quiet, or accept the unacceptable as inevitable. Chapter 7, Segment 3, Resistance, Memory, and the Fragile Line Between Humanity and Oblivion. Even within the shadow cast by the Einsatzgruppen, resistance did exist, fragile and fragmented, emerging not as armies or formal rebellions, but as acts of defiance woven into the fabric of daily survival, where choosing to remember, to document, or to help another person could itself be a form of rebellion against annihilation. Jewish communities, already stripped of weapons, rights, and resources, found ways to resist through underground networks that shared information about impending massacres, falsified documents, and escape routes, even as the geography of occupied Eastern Europe made flight increasingly impossible. Partisan groups formed in forests and marshlands, composed of escaped Jews, Soviet prisoners of war, and local fighters, striking supply lines and German patrols when possible, knowing that reprisals would be swift and merciless. Some civilians hid neighbors in attics, barns, and cellars, fully aware that discovery meant death for entire families, while others smuggled food, clothing, or messages, preserving life in increments measured by days or hours rather than futures. Perhaps the most enduring form of resistance, however, was the effort to bear witness, as individuals buried diaries, wrote testimonies, and memorized names, determined that even if they did not survive, the truth would outlive the killers. These acts stood in stark contrast to the Nazi obsession with erasure, which intensified as the war turned against Germany, and the Einsatzgruppen were ordered to eliminate evidence of their crimes through Operation 1005, forcing prisoners to exhume mass graves, burn bodies, and scatter ashes in rivers and fields. The attempt to destroy memory revealed an implicit recognition by the perpetrators that what they had done could not withstand the light of history, even as they continued to justify their actions as obedience to orders or ideological necessity. When the war ended and the machinery of killing collapsed, the silence surrounding the Einsatzgruppen did not immediately lift, as survivors returned to landscapes transformed by absence, where villages stood on unmarked graves and former neighbors avoided acknowledgement of what had occurred. The post-war trials, though groundbreaking, prosecuted only a fraction of those responsible, with many perpetrators reintegrating into civilian life, shielded by the enormity of the crime and the world's eagerness to move forward rather than confront uncomfortable truths. Testimonies delivered in courtrooms described killings with clinical detachment, revealing how ordinary language had been adapted to describe extraordinary evil, while victims' voices struggled to be heard amid legal technicalities and geopolitical tensions. Over time, historians, educators, and descendants pieced together fragments from archives, mass graves, and survivor accounts, reconstructing the story that the Einsatzgruppen had tried to erase, transforming forests and ravines into sites of memory rather than anonymity. This process was slow and uneven, shaped by political pressures, denial, and the fading of living witnesses, yet it underscored the enduring power of remembrance as a counterforce to genocide. The legacy of the Einsatzgruppen extends beyond history books and memorials, serving as a warning about how quickly societies can normalize violence when ideology dehumanizes entire populations and institutions reward compliance over conscience. Their story challenges the comforting belief that such crimes belong only to the past, reminding us that the conditions that enabled mass murder, fear, obedience, prejudice, and indifference can re-emerge whenever hatred is legitimized and accountability dissolves. To remember the Einsatzgruppen is therefore not only to honor the millions who were murdered without camps or chambers, but to confront the moral responsibilities of the present, recognizing that silence, denial, and passivity can be as dangerous as overt cruelty. In preserving these histories, humanity draws a fragile but essential line against oblivion, asserting that even when lives are taken, their stories remain, resisting erasure and demanding vigilance in a world where the boundaries between order and atrocity can collapse with terrifying speed. Chapter 8, Segment 1: The Trials, the Excuses, and the Machinery of Denial. When the war finally ended and the ruins of Europe began to settle into an uneasy silence, the men of the Einsatzgruppen did not vanish into myth or legend, but returned, in many cases, to ordinary lives, carrying with them the memory of what they had done and the knowledge of what they might one day be asked to answer for. Unlike the concentration camps, whose physical remains confronted the world with undeniable evidence, the crimes of the Einsatzgruppen were scattered across forests, ravines, fields, and villages, often unmarked and already partially erased by time, weather, and deliberate destruction. This made accountability slow, fragmented, and politically fragile, as the early post-war years were dominated by competing priorities, rebuilding nations, confronting the emerging Cold War, and deciding how much of the past could be unearthed without destabilizing the future. It was within this uncertain landscape that the Einsatzgruppen trials emerged, not as a single moment of justice, but as a hesitant attempt to confront crimes so vast that even legal language struggled to contain them. Beginning in 1947, a series of proceedings held by American military tribunals in Nuremberg focused specifically on the Einsatzgruppen commanders, bringing 14 senior leaders to trial for crimes against humanity, war crimes, and genocide. The evidence presented was overwhelming, consisting not only of survivor testimony, but of the perpetrators' own meticulously kept reports, which documented executions with chilling precision, reducing human lives to numbers and logistical details. Yet even in the face of such documentation, the defendants consistently relied on a narrow set of defenses, claiming obedience to orders, loyalty to the state, and the impossibility of refusal within the rigid hierarchy of the SS. They portrayed themselves as functionaries trapped within a system, insisting that moral responsibility lay elsewhere, higher up the chain of command, or within the abstract force of history itself. This argument exposed a central tension of the post-war reckoning, as the trials sought to establish that individuals could not surrender their moral agency to ideology or authority without consequence, even as many observers quietly wondered how they themselves might have acted under similar pressures. The verdicts were significant but limited, with 14 men convicted and 14 sentenced to death, while others received prison terms later reduced or commuted, reflecting shifting political priorities and growing discomfort with prolonged punishment as Germany became a strategic ally in the Cold War. Beyond these trials, thousands of lower-ranking perpetrators were never prosecuted at all, their identities lost amid the sheer scale of participation and the lack of comprehensive investigative resources. In West Germany, subsequent efforts to pursue justice were often hampered by legal constraints, societal reluctance, and the reintegration of former Nazis in a civil service, policing, and the judiciary, creating an environment in which accountability was partial and uneven. Public discourse frequently framed the Einsatzgruppen as aberrations, emphasizing a small group of fanatics rather than confronting the broader reality that mass murder had depended on widespread cooperation, passive acceptance, and institutional support. This selective memory allowed many societies to distance themselves from responsibility, reinforcing the comforting illusion that evil had been confined to a few identifiable villains rather than embedded within ordinary structures of governance and obedience. At the same time, survivors struggled to make their voices heard, often encountering disbelief, fatigue, or the expectation that silence was preferable to reopening wounds, as communities sought normalcy at the cost of truth. Over the decades that followed, historians painstakingly reconstructed the scope of the Einsatzgruppen crimes, drawing on newly opened archives, archaeological investigations of mass graves, and the testimonies of witnesses who had carried their memories for a lifetime. These efforts gradually shifted understanding away from simplified narratives toward a more disturbing recognition of how modern bureaucratic systems, professional training, and ideological indoctrination had converged to enable genocide without camps or factories of death. The legacy of the Einsatzgruppen trials, therefore, lies not only in the sentences imposed, but in the questions they raised and left unresolved about guilt, complicity, and the limits of justice in the aftermath of mass violence. They revealed how easily legal processes can be constrained by political context, and how memory itself becomes a battleground, contested between remembrance and forgetting, accountability and denial. In confronting these trials, the world was forced to grapple with an unsettling truth that the greatest crimes are not always committed by monsters in isolation, but by men who learn to see murder as duty, paperwork, and routine, and who rely on the hope that history will eventually look away. Chapter 8, Segment 2, Memory, Silence, and the Struggle to Name the Dead. As the decades passed after the trials faded from headlines, the true reckoning with the Einsatzgruppen shifted away from courtrooms and into the slow, often painful work of memory, where historians, survivors, and descendants confronted not only what had happened, but how thoroughly it had been buried beneath layers of silence, denial, and convenience. Across Eastern Europe, the landscapes where the Einsatzgruppen had carried out their massacres returned to ordinary use. Forests regrew over execution sites, ravines filled with soil and leaves, and villages resumed their rhythms, often without markers, memorials, or even whispered acknowledgement of what lay beneath the ground. This absence was not accidental, but the result of multiple forces converging, including Nazi efforts during the war to erase evidence through operations like Action 1005, post-war Soviet suppression of Jewish specificity and Holocaust memory, and local communities' reluctance to confront the role of neighbors who had watched, assisted, or benefited from the removal of Jewish populations. For survivors, the lack of visible remembrance created a second wound, as the deaths of entire families were reduced to statistics, and the places where they were murdered became nameless and anonymous, reinforcing the very erasure the Nazis had sought to achieve. In the West, Holocaust education initially focused heavily on concentration camps and gas chambers, partly because they offered tangible structures and photographic evidence, while the decentralized, open-air killings of the Einsatzgruppen were more difficult to visualize and explain. This imbalance shaped public understanding, allowing many to believe that genocide required industrial infrastructure, rather than recognizing that mass murder could be carried out with rifles, lists of names, and the cooperation of ordinary institutions. It was only through persistent scholarship, survivor advocacy, and the gradual opening of archives after the Cold War that the full scale of the Einsatzgruppen murders began to enter public consciousness, revealing that they were not a prelude to the Holocaust, but an integral and defining phase of it. Researchers uncovered Einsatzgruppen reports detailing daily body counts, correspondence between commanders discussing efficiency and morale, and testimonies from local witnesses who described the sounds of gunfire echoing through villages, followed by unnatural silences that lasted for generations. Memorialization efforts slowly followed, with mass graves identified, monuments erected, and educational initiatives developed to restore names to victims who had been buried without record or ceremony. Yet these efforts often faced resistance, as acknowledging the Einsatzgruppen forced uncomfortable questions about collaboration, anti-Semitism, and the ease with which societies can adapt to violence when it is normalized by authority. In some regions, memorials were vandalized or opposed, and historical narratives were contested by nationalist movements seeking to reinterpret or minimize local involvement. At the same time, the descendants of perpetrators grappled with inherited guilt and fragmented knowledge, discovering family histories that had been hidden or distorted, and struggling to reconcile personal identity with collective responsibility. The story of the Einsatzgruppen thus became not only a historical subject, but a moral test of how societies choose to remember, whether they confront the past honestly or allow selective memory to shape national myths. Educational institutions increasingly emphasize the importance of these killings in understanding genocide, highlighting how the Einsatzgruppen demonstrated that mass murder does not require secrecy or advanced technology, only ideology, obedience, and the willingness of institutions to dehumanize entire populations. Survivors who spoke in their final years emphasized that remembrance was not about revenge or hatred, but about vigilance, warning future generations that the conditions which produced the Einsatzgruppen were not unique to Nazi Germany, but rooted in universal human vulnerabilities to fear, conformity, and propaganda. As eyewitnesses passed away, responsibility shifted to historians, educators, and listeners to carry these stories forward, resisting the pull of abstraction and insisting on specificity, names, places, and lived experiences. In this way, memory itself became an act of resistance, countering the Einsatzgruppen's goal of total annihilation by affirming that every victim mattered, every life was real, and every death demanded acknowledgement. The struggle to name the dead, mark the ground, and teach the truth remains ongoing, reminding the world that justice delayed is not only a legal failure, but a moral one, and that forgetting is not passive, but an active choice with consequences that echo far beyond the past. Chapter 8, Segment 3, Lessons, Warnings, and the Fragile Line Between Civilization and Collapse. As the full history of the Einsatzgruppen emerged into public awareness, their story became more than a record of past crimes. It became a mirror held up to modern societies, reflecting uncomfortable truths about how easily violence can be normalized when it is framed as duty, security, or necessity. The men who carried out these killings were not mythical monsters or anomalies torn from the margins of humanity, but teachers, clerks, engineers, lawyers, and fathers who had been shaped by institutions that rewarded obedience and punished doubt. Their transformation did not occur overnight, nor was it driven solely by personal hatred, but by a gradual erosion of moral boundaries, reinforced by ideology, peer pressure, bureaucratic language, and the promise that responsibility lay elsewhere. Orders were issued from desks far removed from the ravines and forests, and yet each execution required countless individual choices, each one narrowing the distance between normal life and mass murder. The Einsatzgruppen reveal how genocide can unfold not as a sudden eruption of chaos, but as an organized process embedded within familiar systems of administration, transportation, record-keeping, and command. Their reports spoke of operations and results, turning human beings into numbers and reducing death to a logistical achievement, a transformation that made killing psychologically manageable while masking its reality behind abstraction. This language, so sterile and detached, serves as a warning of how words can anesthetize conscience and make atrocity appear routine. The story also exposes the danger of silence, showing how bystanders, collaborators, and institutions that chose neutrality or self-preservation became part of the machinery of destruction, even when they never pulled a trigger. Villagers who looked away, officials who provided lists, and neighbors who occupied abandoned homes all contributed to a system in which violence could proceed unchallenged. At the same time, the history of the Einsatzgruppen includes moments of refusal and resistance, rare but significant, where individuals declined to participate, requested reassignment, or attempted to shield victims, demonstrating that alternatives existed, even within a brutal regime. These acts, though often overlooked, undermine the myth that perpetrators had no choice, reinforcing the principle that moral agency persists even under extreme pressure. In the post-war world, the legacy of the Einsatzgruppen has shaped international law, contributing to the development of concepts such as crimes against humanity, genocide, and universal jurisdiction, and influencing how future atrocities are investigated and prosecuted. Yet legal frameworks alone cannot prevent repetition, as the underlying conditions that enabled these crimes, dehumanization, propaganda, fear of the other, and the concentration of power, remain present in different forms across time and place. Education, therefore, becomes central, not as a recitation of facts, but as a cultivation of critical thinking, empathy, and historical awareness that equips individuals to recognize early warning signs before violence becomes normalized. The Einsatzgruppen challenge the comforting belief that civilization is a permanent state, reminding us instead that it is a fragile agreement sustained by shared values and constant vigilance. Their story demonstrates how quickly norms can shift when authority defines certain lives as expendable, and how easily ordinary people can be drawn into extraordinary crimes when moral boundaries are reframed as obstacles to progress or survival. Remembering the Einsatzgruppen is thus not only about honoring victims, but about confronting the capacity for harm that exists within human systems, including our own. It asks listeners to consider how language, loyalty, and fear shape behavior, and how responsibility cannot be fully outsourced to leaders, ideologies, or historical circumstances. As the last survivors pass and memory transitions fully into history, the obligation to remember becomes collective, resting with those who choose to learn, teach, and speak about what occurred. In doing so, the legacy of the Einsatzgruppen becomes a warning etched into the historical record, reminding the world that genocide does not begin with killing, but with ideas, silence, and a gradual acceptance of cruelty as normal. To study this history is to accept a responsibility, not only to the past, but to the future, ensuring that the conditions which allowed mobile death squads to roam Europe in broad daylight are recognized and resisted wherever they threaten to reappear. Chapter 9, Segment 1, Memory on Trial, Justice, Denial, and the Long Shadow After the Killings. When the guns of the Einsatzgruppen finally fell silent and the war in Europe came to an end, the landscapes they had scarred did not immediately speak. Forests regrew, ravines filled, towns rebuilt, and for years the earth itself seemed to absorb the evidence of what had occurred, leaving survivors, investigators, and future generations to grapple with crimes that were deliberately buried, denied, or minimized. In the immediate aftermath of liberation, the scale of the killings stunned even seasoned Allied officials, many of whom had been prepared for the horrors of concentration camps, but were unready for the revelation that entire communities had been annihilated in open-air executions, far from any camp gates or barbed wire. The Einsatzgruppen massacres pose a unique challenge for justice because they were both systematic and decentralized, carried out by mobile units whose victims were often left unnamed and undocumented, their deaths recorded only in the perpetrators' own reports. These reports, chilling in their precision, became some of the most important evidence in post-war trials, revealing not only the numbers killed, but the bureaucratic mindset that framed murder as an administrative task. At Nuremberg, prosecutors sought to establish that the Einsatzgruppen were not rogue units acting independently, but integral components of a state-directed program of extermination, operating under clear orders from the highest levels of the Nazi leadership. The Einsatzgruppen trial of 1947 to 1948, one of the subsequent Nuremberg proceedings, placed 14 senior commanders in the dock, confronting them with their own words, signatures, and operational summaries. Many defendants attempted to shield themselves behind claims of obedience, arguing that refusal would have meant death or severe punishment, yet historical evidence showed that reassignment was often possible, and that ideological commitment, ambition, and conformity played far greater roles than coercion alone. The trial exposed a moral paradox that would haunt post-war societies: how to punish crimes so vast that no sentence could truly match their scale, while still affirming the principle that individuals are responsible for their actions, even within criminal systems. While several Einsatzgruppen leaders were convicted and executed, many lower-ranking participants reintegrated quietly into civilian life, benefiting from the practical limits of post-war justice, Cold War priorities, and a widespread reluctance to reopen wounds in societies struggling to rebuild. In West Germany, early efforts to prosecute perpetrators were often half-hearted, hampered by former Nazis occupying positions in the judiciary, police, and civil service, and by a public narrative that emphasized German suffering while marginalizing Jewish victimhood. In Eastern Europe, Soviet investigations documented mass graves, but framed the crimes primarily in terms of anti-fascist resistance, often downplaying the specifically anti-Semitic nature of the killings. This selective memory created a fragmented historical record, in which the Einsatzgruppen were simultaneously known and unknown, acknowledged in archives, yet absent from everyday consciousness. Denial and distortion soon followed, with some individuals and groups attempting to minimize the killings, question victim numbers, or recast the perpetrators as ordinary soldiers trapped by circumstance, a trend that underscored the enduring danger of historical revisionism. Over time, however, scholars, journalists, and descendants of victims began to reconstruct the story more fully, using forensic archaeology, newly opened archives, and survivor testimony to map execution sites and restore names to the dead. Mass graves were located in Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania, Latvia, and beyond, transforming anonymous fields into places of mourning and remembrance, even as political tensions sometimes complicated commemoration. These efforts revealed that the legacy of the Einsatzgruppen was not confined to the years of war, but continued to shape identities, landscapes, and moral debates decades later. The struggle for justice became less about courtroom verdicts and more about recognition, education, and the refusal to allow these crimes to fade into abstraction. By the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the Einsatzgruppen had come to symbolize a critical truth about the Holocaust, that genocide does not require distant factories of death alone, but can be enacted face-to-face by neighbors, officials, and soldiers who have accepted a worldview that strips others of humanity. Chapter 9 opens not with closure, but with unresolved questions about accountability, memory, and the limits of justice, asking how societies remember crimes that were designed to leave no witnesses, and how the pursuit of truth continues long after the perpetrators and victims themselves are gone. Chapter 9, Segment 2, Silence, Complicity, and the Inheritance of Memory. As decades passed after the war, the story of the Einsatzgruppen entered a dangerous second phase, not one of bullets and mass graves, but of silence, avoidance, and selective remembrance, where entire societies wrestled with how much truth they were willing to confront about what had happened in their villages, forests, and streets. In many of the regions where the Einsatzgruppen operated, the killers had not arrived alone. They were guided by local collaborators, aided by informants, and sometimes joined by police units or civilians who knew exactly where Jewish families lived, who owned businesses, who had fled, and who remained behind locked doors. After the war, these communities often chose quiet over confrontation, rebuilding homes and lives atop unmarked graves, passing down stories that omitted names, roles, and uncomfortable details. Children grew up playing near ravines without being told why the earth there sank strangely, or why elders lowered their voices when the past was mentioned. This silence was not accidental. It was a coping mechanism, a shield against guilt, fear, and the destabilizing realization that genocide had unfolded not in distant camps alone, but in familiar places with familiar faces. In Germany, the post-war narrative of reconstruction and economic miracle offered an opportunity to look forward rather than back, and many former Einsatzgruppen members blended seamlessly into civilian life, becoming clerks, teachers, businessmen, and even respected community figures. Their neighbors often knew fragments of their pasts but chose not to ask questions, reinforcing a collective amnesia that allowed perpetrators to age in peace while victims' families searched endlessly for acknowledgement. In Eastern Europe, shifting borders and regimes further complicated memory. Soviet authorities documented mass killings, but discouraged independent commemoration, framing the dead as generic victims of fascism rather than as Jews targeted for annihilation. This erased specificity had profound consequences, stripping the Einsatzgruppen crimes of their ideological context and making it easier for denial and distortion to take root in later years. Holocaust denial movements seized on this fragmentation, exploiting gaps in documentation and the absence of visible infrastructure like camps to cast doubt on eyewitness accounts and forensic evidence, even as thousands of execution reports written by the killers themselves lay preserved in archives. Against this tide, survivors and descendants became reluctant historians, carrying memories that institutions had failed to protect, recounting the sound of gunfire, the smell of soil turned by shovels, the last words shouted at the edge of pits. Their testimonies challenged the comfort of forgetting and forced a reckoning with the human dimension of the crimes. Children torn from parents, neighbors watching from behind curtains, victims forced to undress and lie atop those already dead. As time passed, a new generation began to ask questions their parents had avoided, driven by a growing recognition that silence itself was a form of complicity. Scholars traced patterns of behavior, showing how ideological indoctrination, peer pressure, career ambition, and moral disengagement transformed ordinary men into executioners, dismantling the myth that only fanatics or sadists could commit such acts. Memorial projects slowly emerged at massacre sites, often initiated by grassroots efforts rather than governments, marking places like Babi, Ponary, and Rumbula with stones, plaques, and names, sometimes after decades of neglect. These memorials did more than honor the dead. They confronted the living with the reality that genocide leaves physical and moral scars that do not fade with time. Yet even as remembrance expanded, resistance persisted, with political movements and nationalist narratives attempting to sanitize history, portraying collaborators as patriots or dismissing Jewish suffering as secondary to broader wartime losses. This struggle over memory revealed that the legacy of the Einsatzgruppen was not confined to the past, but actively shaped contemporary debates about identity, responsibility, and truth. Education became a battleground, with historians emphasizing that the Einsatzgruppen represent a warning about how quickly moral boundaries can collapse when authority legitimizes hatred and dehumanization. Their story demonstrated that genocide is not only the product of monstrous leaders, but of systems that reward obedience and suppress empathy, making participation seem normal, even necessary. Chapter 9's second segment confronts the inheritance of this history, showing how the aftermath of the Einsatzgruppen killings rippled outward across generations, leaving unanswered questions about justice, the ethics of remembrance, and the obligation of societies to face the darkest chapters of their own pasts, not to dwell in guilt, but to guard against repetition. Chapter 9, Segment 3, Judgment Without Closure and the Weight of What Remains. Even as memorials were erected and archives opened, the question that haunted the history of the Einsatzgruppen was never fully resolved. Could justice ever match the scale of the crime? And could law ever account for the annihilation of entire communities whose voices were silenced before they could testify? The post-war trials, though groundbreaking, were inherently limited, constrained by time, political will, and the sheer impossibility of prosecuting tens of thousands of perpetrators who had participated directly or indirectly in mass murder. Many Einsatzgruppen leaders stood before judges and spoke calmly about logistics, orders, and procedures, describing executions in clinical terms that stripped their actions of human consequence, while survivors and historians struggled to reinsert names, faces, and lives into the sterile language of indictments. Sentences varied wildly. Some received life imprisonment, others a handful of years, and many were eventually released early, reintegrating into societies that preferred reconciliation over sustained accountability. This uneven justice created a lingering wound, particularly for descendants of victims who watched as men responsible for wiping out entire villages lived long lives, raised families, and died peacefully, their crimes acknowledged only in footnotes of history books. The Cold War further complicated matters, as geopolitical priorities shifted attention away from Nazi crimes toward new enemies, turning former perpetrators into assets or liabilities, depending on their usefulness rather than their guilt. Files were sealed, investigations abandoned, and the pursuit of justice slowed to a crawl, reinforcing the painful truth that legal systems are often shaped less by moral urgency than by political convenience. Yet even incomplete justice carried symbolic power. The trials established that genocide was not an abstract tragedy, but a prosecutable crime, that following orders did not absolve responsibility, and that mass murder could be documented, reconstructed, and named for what it was. Over time, historians pieced together execution reports, letters home, photographs taken by the killers themselves, and survivor testimonies to create an unassailable record that countered denial and distortion, proving that the Einsatzgruppen killings were systematic, intentional, and central to the Holocaust, not a chaotic byproduct of war. This documentation transformed ravines and forests into historical sites, forcing a reckoning with landscapes that had long concealed their dead beneath grass and snow. Educational programs began to emphasize the Einsatzgruppen as a critical chapter in understanding how genocide evolves, not suddenly, but through escalating normalization of violence, where shooting civilians becomes routine, bureaucratized, and emotionally distanced. The perpetrator's own words revealed chilling self-awareness. Some complained not about killing, but about the psychological toll on shooters, leading to innovations that prioritized efficiency and reduced emotional strain, a logic that ultimately contributed to the development of gas chambers. In this way, the Einsatzgruppen stand as a bridge between ideological hatred and industrialized murder, demonstrating how human suffering was refined into a process optimized for speed and scale. As survivors aged and passed away, urgency grew to preserve their testimonies, recognizing that memory itself was becoming fragile, vulnerable to erosion by time and misinformation. Museums, digital archives, and oral history projects emerged as guardians of this knowledge, ensuring that future generations would hear not only what happened, but how it felt to live through terror, where neighbors vanished overnight and forests echoed with gunfire. The moral challenge of this legacy lies not only in remembrance, but in vigilance, understanding that the conditions that enabled the Einsatzgruppen were not unique to Nazi Germany, but rooted in universal human tendencies toward conformity, obedience, and dehumanization when authority legitimizes cruelty. Their story forces an uncomfortable reflection. Genocide does not require monsters alone, but ordinary individuals willing to suspend empathy and outsource conscience to ideology. In the modern world where mass violence is often mediated through distance, drones, algorithms, and bureaucratic language, the Einsatzgruppen serve as a stark reminder that the most devastating crimes are often committed face-to-face by people who once lived ordinary lives. Chapter 9's final segment confronts this unresolved inheritance, acknowledging that while justice may never be complete and closure may remain elusive, the responsibility to remember, to teach, and to resist denial endures. The legacy of the Einsatzgruppen is not only written in graves and trial transcripts, but in the ongoing moral obligation to recognize warning signs of hatred, to challenge narratives that dehumanize, and to ensure that the silence which once followed the sound of gunfire is never allowed to fall again. Chapter 10, Segment 1, Memory as Resistance and the Final Reckoning of History. As the 20th century receded and the last witnesses to the Einsatzgruppen murders grew old, the burden of memory shifted decisively from survivors to society itself, transforming remembrance from a personal act of mourning into a collective moral responsibility that transcended borders, generations, and identities. What distinguished the legacy of the Einsatzgruppen from other chapters of the Holocaust was the intimacy of their crimes. The killers stood within meters of their victims, heard their voices, saw their faces, and pulled the trigger anyway, leaving behind not only mass graves, but an enduring question about the limits of human conscience when authority grants permission to destroy. In the decades after the trials, historians increasingly understood that the true danger lay not only in the crimes themselves, but in the mechanisms that made them possible. Language that reduced people to categories, bureaucratic structures that fragmented responsibility, and ideological training that framed murder as duty rather than atrocity. The Einsatzgruppen were not rogue units acting in isolation. They were an integral component of a state-sanctioned project of annihilation, supported by military logistics, civilian cooperation, and a culture that rewarded obedience over moral resistance. This realization forced a reevaluation of how genocide is taught and remembered, shifting focus from singular villains to systems of power that convert prejudice into policy and violence into routine administration. Memorials erected at massacre sites across Eastern Europe often consist of simple markers, stones, plaques, modest monuments. Yet their quiet presence speaks volumes, standing in landscapes that once bore witness to unimaginable horror and now serve as classrooms without walls, where silence itself becomes testimony. In places like Babi, Rumbula, and Ponary, the earth still carries the weight of history, reminding visitors that genocide does not always announce itself with factories of death, but can unfold in forests and fields under open skies, hidden in plain sight. Educational initiatives increasingly emphasize this truth, warning that the absence of barbed wire or chimneys does not lessen the reality of extermination, and that the early phases of genocide are often the most dangerous precisely because they appear improvised, localized, or temporary. The Einsatzgruppen narrative also exposes the fragility of justice. While some perpetrators were punished, many evaded accountability entirely, protected by post-war chaos, political expediency, or the simple passage of time, leaving survivors and descendants to grapple with an incomplete sense of reckoning. Yet even this imperfect justice contributed to the development of international law, influencing the codification of crimes against humanity and reinforcing the principle that state authority cannot legitimize mass murder, a legal legacy that continues to shape responses to atrocities in the modern era. As denial and distortion began to surface in various forms, ranging from outright rejection of historical facts to subtle minimization of scale, the meticulous documentation of Einsatzgruppen crimes became a bulwark against erasure, demonstrating the power of evidence, scholarship, and testimony to confront falsehood with irrefutable truth. Digital archives now preserve execution reports, photographs, and court records, ensuring that future generations can access primary sources that reveal not only what happened, but how it was rationalized by those who carried it out. This accessibility transforms memory into an active process rather than a static monument, inviting continual engagement, questioning, and reflection. The story of the Einsatzgruppen ultimately challenges viewers to confront uncomfortable parallels in the present. The persistence of extremist ideologies, the ease with which dehumanizing language spreads, and the temptation to prioritize order, security, or national identity over the inherent worth of human life. Remembering their crimes is not an exercise in historical guilt, but a warning about the conditions under which ordinary individuals can become agents of extraordinary evil when moral boundaries are systematically dismantled. Chapter 10 opens by asserting that remembrance itself is a form of resistance against denial, against indifference, and against the normalization of hatred, and that the final reckoning of the Einsatzgruppen is not confined to courtrooms or history books, but lives on in the choices societies make when confronted with injustice today. Their legacy compels an enduring vigilance, a refusal to accept silence where voices should rise, and a commitment to ensuring that the forests and ravines of Europe remain sites of memory rather than blueprints for future crimes, affirming that while history cannot be undone, its lessons can still shape a more humane world. Chapter 10, Segment 2, The Long Shadow, How the Einsatzgruppen Changed the World Forever. The legacy of the Einsatzgruppen did not end with the last gunshot or the final mass grave seal beneath layers of earth. Instead, it cast a long and enduring shadow over the post-war world, reshaping international law, historical consciousness, and humanity's understanding of how genocide truly unfolds. In the immediate aftermath of the war, the sheer scale of the crimes committed by these mobile killing units forced jurists and historians to confront a terrifying reality. Genocide did not require death camps, industrial infrastructure, or elaborate secrecy. It could be carried out by small groups of men with orders, weapons, and ideological permission, operating openly in occupied territories with little resistance. This realization directly influenced the development of modern human rights frameworks, including the Genocide Convention of 1948, which sought to define and prevent crimes that the Einsatzgruppen had embodied in their most brutal form. Their actions demonstrated that genocide begins long before extermination camps are built, beginning instead with words, classifications, lists, and the gradual removal of legal and moral protections from targeted groups. In this way, the Einsatzgruppen became a case study in how bureaucratic systems and military discipline can merge with extremist ideology to produce mass murder that appears methodical, normalized, and even mundane to those carrying it out. Scholars later emphasized that many perpetrators were not fanatical sadists but educated professionals. Lawyers, teachers, clerks, men who adapted to killing as a job requirement, revealing how ordinary individuals can be transformed into executioners when obedience is rewarded and dissent is punished. This understanding profoundly altered Holocaust education, shifting the narrative away from the myth of incomprehensible monsters toward a more unsettling truth, that the conditions which produced the Einsatzgruppen are not unique to Nazi Germany, but can emerge anywhere when fear, nationalism, and dehumanization are allowed to dominate public life. The shadow of their crimes also loomed over post-war Europe's struggle with memory and accountability, as many nations confronted uncomfortable questions about local collaboration, silent complicity, and the willingness of civilians to look away while mass murder occurred nearby. In some regions, the massacre sites remained unmarked for decades, suppressed by political regimes that found remembrance inconvenient or destabilizing, further compounding the injustice suffered by victims whose deaths were denied even symbolic recognition. It was only through the persistence of survivors, historians, and later generations that these silences began to break, transforming forgotten ravines and forests into places of remembrance and education. The Einsatzgruppen legacy also reshaped how military ethics are taught, reinforcing the principle that following orders can never excuse crimes against humanity, and that individual responsibility remains paramount even within rigid hierarchies of command. This lesson reverberated through later conflicts, informing debates about war crimes, civilian protection, and the moral obligations of soldiers operating under authoritarian regimes. At the same time, the psychological toll of these crimes extended far beyond the perpetrators and victims, affecting entire societies that inherited landscapes scarred by unacknowledged trauma, where absence itself became a presence. Entire communities erased, languages silenced, traditions severed. The Einsatzgruppen forced the world to reckon with a form of violence that was intimate yet massive, decentralized yet systematic, exposing how genocide can unfold incrementally, disguised as security operations or administrative necessity. Their history remains a warning that mass violence often begins not with chaos, but with order, meetings, paperwork, commands delivered calmly and executed efficiently. As new generations encounter this history through museums, digital archives, and education programs, the story of the Einsatzgruppen continues to challenge simplistic narratives of good and evil, demanding a deeper examination of moral courage, civic responsibility, and the cost of indifference. Chapter 10, Segment 2 emphasizes that the true horror of the Einsatzgruppen lies not only in the number of lives they destroyed, but in the lessons their crimes impart about the vulnerability of civilization itself, reminding us that the boundary between humanity and barbarity is neither fixed nor distant, but dependent on the choices societies make when confronted with hatred, authority, and fear. Chapter 10, Segment 3, Never Again is a Choice, Memory, Responsibility, and the Future. The final and most enduring lesson of the Einsatzgruppen is not found solely in archives, court transcripts, or mass graves, but in the ongoing responsibility of memory. Because genocide does not end when the killing stops. It ends only when remembrance is sustained and denial is defeated. The Einsatzgruppen reveal a truth that remains deeply uncomfortable, that the Holocaust was not only engineered from the top by men in offices, but carried out face-to-face by ordinary individuals who learned to see their victims not as neighbors, not as families, not as human beings, but as abstractions to be erased. This transformation did not happen overnight. It was cultivated through years of propaganda, fear, obedience, and gradual moral erosion, showing that genocide is a process long before it becomes an event. Remembering the Einsatzgruppen, therefore, means understanding how societies slide toward violence step by step, how language becomes poisoned, how laws become tools of exclusion, how silence becomes complicity, and how violence becomes normalized when it is framed as duty or necessity. In the decades since World War II, historians have uncovered countless details about these mobile death squads, yet no amount of documentation can fully convey the terror experienced by those forced to kneel at the edge of a pit, hearing the gunfire behind them, knowing what awaited next. That terror echoes forward in time, carried by descendants who inherit not memories but absences, empty homes, lost names, unspoken grief. The responsibility to remember does not belong only to survivors or scholars. It belongs to every generation that benefits from the freedoms denied to those murdered without trial, without mercy, without graves. Memorials, education, and testimony serve not as rituals of the past, but as defenses against the future, because the conditions that enabled the Einsatzgruppen, authoritarianism, racial hatred, blind obedience, and the devaluation of human life, have not disappeared from the world. They resurface whenever people are reduced to categories, whenever violence is justified as protection, whenever empathy is replaced with fear. The Einsatzgruppen teach that genocide can occur without factories of death, without barbed wire, without secrecy. It can happen in open fields, in daylight, with neighbors watching, if society decides that some lives no longer matter. This realization places an ethical burden on the present, to challenge dehumanization wherever it appears, to resist narratives that divide humanity into worthy and unworthy, and to recognize early warning signs before violence becomes irreversible. Justice, though imperfect, remains part of this responsibility. Acknowledging victims by name, correcting historical falsehoods, and confronting denial wherever it arises, whether through distortion, minimization, or outright lies. Education about the Einsatzgruppen must therefore go beyond facts and figures, reaching into moral reflection, asking not only what happened, but how it was allowed to happen and what choices individuals made along the way. The perpetrator's ordinariness is precisely what makes their crimes so vital to remember, because it strips away the comforting illusion that genocide is carried out only by monsters, rather than by people who surrender their conscience to authority. As time distances us from the events of the Holocaust, memory becomes more fragile, more vulnerable to erosion, making the act of remembrance an active, deliberate choice rather than a passive inheritance. To say never again is not to declare victory over history, but to accept responsibility for vigilance, to listen when survivors speak, to protect truth when it is challenged, and to stand against hatred before it gains momentum. The story of the Einsatzgruppen ends not with their executions or imprisonments, but with the unanswered question they leave behind. What will future generations do when faced with the same crossroads of obedience and humanity? This final segment affirms that remembrance is not only an act of mourning, but an act of resistance, ensuring that the millions murdered in forests and ravines are not reduced to statistics, and that the silence the Nazis sought to impose is replaced by knowledge, conscience, and resolve. In remembering the Einsatzgruppen, we honor the victims not only by recalling how they died, but by committing ourselves to a world where such crimes are recognized early, confronted courageously, and never allowed to happen again. Let the silence speak. Let memory endure as this documentary comes to an end. The story of the Einsatzgruppen does not. It lives on in the soil of Eastern Europe, in unmarked graves beneath forests and fields, and in the silence left behind where entire communities once stood. These men were not shadows of history. They were its warning. They showed how quickly law can become cruelty, how obedience can become murder, and how ordinary people can participate in extraordinary evil when conscience is surrendered. Remembering the Einsatzgruppen is not about dwelling in horror. It is about responsibility. It is about recognizing that genocide does not begin with killing. It begins with words, with division, with the slow stripping away of humanity. The victims of these mobile death squads were not anonymous masses. They were mothers, fathers, children, neighbors, teachers, musicians, dreamers. They were lives interrupted, futures erased. History does not ask us only to remember what happened. It asks us what we will do with that knowledge. If this documentary moved you, disturbed you, or forced you to reflect, let that feeling matter. Share their stories. Speak their names. Defend truth when it is challenged, because memory is the last thing violence cannot destroy. Thank you for watching, for bearing witness, and for choosing remembrance over silence. Never again is not a slogan. It is a responsibility.